Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I am Farah Abul Rub. I'm a third year medical student, and I apologize if my voice is not as clear as usual. I'm a bit sick, so pardon me, please, for that. And if you at any point hear a screaming cow in the background, that's just one of my cats, so don't worry about it. He's just whining because I'm not giving him all of my attention, so he's completely fine. All right, so Brainstem, the notorious thing about neural and the aspect that almost everyone always complains about, that is the most difficult. So I tried my best to simplify this as easily as humanly possible. So you will see that this entire thing is very shortened, it's very condensed. However, it is also very simplified. I tried my best to include everything that you need to know. And so that I don't overwhelm you guys, we have split the session into two parts. For today's part, I will be very briefly going over the spinal cord and tracts review, the brainstem anatomy, the cranial nerve functions and their nuclei, the blood supply, and finally the conclusion, which is basically just to be continued. Just one second, I might have opened the wrong presentation. Just a second, because I have two versions of it. Yep, I did. Sorry, apologies for that. All right. All right, there we go. This should be the correct one, I'm hoping. Sorry about that. Okay, so as I said, we would be going over a very brief review of the spinal cord tract. Then we'll be going over the gross anatomy of the brainstem, its blood supply, the cranial nerves functions and their exits and their nuclei. And then for the next part, we'll be going over the cross sections as well as the actual lesions. So stay tuned for that. Now, first of all, let's start by going over a very brief overview of what the brainstem actually is, i.e. the things they usually assume for you to just know automatically. So going over the development and the embryologic origin of everything, we can see that the neural tube becomes three separate entities that are the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. These will then give rise to five different components, or actually six, depending on how you want to look at it. The telencephalon is going to become the cerebrum, and we don't worry about that right now. The diencephalon is going to give me the thalamus, the hypothalamus, all the good stuff that you guys have done in endo-repro in second year. So don't worry about that either. What we really care about is the mesencephalon and the myelencephalon. Okay, so both of those are what basically is going to give me my brain stem. So everything that starts with an M, the mesencephalon, the metencephalon, the myelencephalon, all of those are going to contribute towards the formation of my brain stem. The metencephalon, however, is not only going to contribute to the brain stem, it is also going to give me the cerebellum. And this relation is very, very significant because every time I talk about the pons, I will somehow relate it to the cerebellum. And it makes a lot of sense that they both have a common embryonic origin due to the similarity in their pathways. So don't know the details of this. This isn't my forte, like this isn't what I'm supposed to be teaching you, but this is just to show you guys that objects that have a similar embryonic origin are going to have a similar sort of presentation, even into adulthood. Now, what I really want you guys to focus on is these adult neuronal canal regions. Why are those important? If I were to just present you with the CSF, if I were to just show you the ventricular system, it would be very beneficial for you to be able to realize what correlates to it on gross anatomy. So let's take a look at that. Looking at this here, we can see that we have our entire ventricular system. We have our lateral ventricles draining into the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen of Monro. And then the third ventricle is going to drain into the fourth ventricle through our aqueduct of Sylvius. This fourth ventricle will then drain using the foramen of Luschka and Magendie. You guys know this better than I do. But what's really important is realizing that the entirety of the brainstem is within this region here. So I'm always either going to be referring to the fourth ventricle or the aqueduct of Sylvius. Okay, I'm not going to be referring to the third ventricle. I'm not going to be referring to the lateral ventricles. The entirety of the brainstem is going to be here. Now, the brainstem is called the brainstem because it basically acts as this connecting stalk. Okay, so what is it connecting? My spinal cord in the caudal end, so towards the tail end, and the actual cerebrum, as well as the cortex and everything above that from the rostral end. So from the top, I'm going to expect to see the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the actual cerebrum itself, and then from the bottom, I will continue into the spinal cord that you guys all know and love very dearly by now. The actual brainstem is composed of three separate parts. The midbrain, which is this portion right here, and it's called that because it goes exactly in the middle of the brain. The pons, which basically means dilatation, and this is this bulging that you see over here. Okay, it is this portion here. And this is the pons that is super closely related to the cerebellum. Lastly, we have our medulla oblongata, the medulla, whatever you want to call it, both of them work. The medulla oblongata, which is the most caudal structure that we have. Okay, so going from cranial to caudal, once again, I want us to go over everything. Looking at these two here, we have an anterior view and a posterior view, i.e., here the brain would basically sit on top and project outwards towards me. Here it would be projecting to the other side of me, okay? So here it's like I'm looking at someone from the back of their neck. Here it's like I took their brain away, which you don't need to do for most people because it's not even there. And then you just looked at their brainstem, okay? Now, can any of you guys tell me what you think these huge structures here are? Thalamus. All right, perfect. So this does not seem like it is part of the brainstem. It is the most caudal surface. Sorry, it's the most rostral. It is the most cranial, and it is the most superior structure. And it has those two huge bulgings. This is indeed the thalamus. The thalamus is not part of the brainstem. However, it is a relay center for almost all of the tracts that will have to eventually pass through and reach the cerebrum. And the reason why I care to show it to you guys is a lot of times they're going to tell you, oh, it's going to go to the ventral-posterior-lateral nucleus of the thalamus, it's going to do this, it's going to do that, but you don't really know its relation to the brainstem and how it gets there. So I wanted to show you guys this. All right, moving on. What about this portion that's highlighted in teal now? It is right underneath the thalamus. Hypothalamus, interpeduncular fossa, midbrain, hypothalamus, end. Okay, I'm gonna wait for the end. What are we? End. Okay. You guys are absolutely correct. It's all good. This is the hypothalamus. And the way that you can recognize it is immediately under the thalamus. And also, you can see those two bulgings here that are the mammillary bodies. Okay? So it may be confused for the midbrain. However, it is a structure that still acts as basically the interconnection between the midbrain and the thalamus. So you don't go immediately from the thalamus to the midbrain. This, however, that we're now looking at is our midbrain. We have now actually started to look at our brainstem. Now, I know that we're not really familiar with this structure, right? We don't really see this very often, so it's very, very common for you to get confused about all of this. And this is why I wanted to show you guys this, because usually we're just presented with, okay, this is the midbrain, this is the pons, this is that, this is the thalamus, but we don't really see their relation to each other. Okay? What about the interpeduncular fossa? So the interpeduncular fossa is going to be, let me check just a second. It's I it's kind of, I believe, this area here rather than this area here, if I'm not mistaken. Because I remember the doctor said. Yeah. So it is the hypothalamus because it has the mammillary bodies, it has all of those. I believe the interpeduncular fossa refers to the site rather than what the place is in it of itself, because it is between the peduncles. All right, sure thing. Okay, so now we can see the midbrain. And in my opinion, the best way to actually be able to know that this is the midbrain, if we're looking at it anteriorly, is we have those fibers going upwards, and we have those projecting structures here that we can see, which are our cranial nerves. Okay? Now, this looping fellow here is very characteristic of the midbrain. And I'm not highlighting any of those projectings because we'll be discussing them later, but you should know that this nerve right here and this one that is this continuation would both be within the midbrain. Something else that can help me to realize that this is the midbrain is those two hills that I have here, those two bumps, okay? We'll get to what those are in a second. All right. So after the midbrain, we have our pons, which is this dilatation that we have. It is this projection that we have. And as you can see, anteriorly, it lies flat, but posteriorly, it has this opening here. Could you guys tell me what this opening might be? Fourth ventricle. Perfect. All right. So lastly, the third and the most caudal part is the medulla oblongata, which you guys can see over here. It has this very conal sort of arrangement. It's very long, it's very extended, and this will be significant when we actually begin to look at the nuclei that we have, because you will start to see that even the nuclei kind of get stretched out. So oblongata, the way that I like to remember it, is elongated, basically. Okay, so oblong. All right. Moving on, let's take a look at a bit of the more detailed features. We have those two projections here that are kind of like bulgings. They're thick, they're kind of a very specific shape. What might those two be? And remember, we're looking at this anteriorly right now. The pyramids, yes, perfect. So those are the pyramids. And what is the significance that we have about the pyramids? Do you guys remember? Based on the spinal cord? Corticospinal tract, yes, perfect. So this is where we're going to have the decussation of our corticospinal tract or our pyramidal tract, and that is what actually gives it its name. These pyramids, here you guys can see, I'm not sure if you can properly see it with the highlight, but there's like those crisscross fibers within the medulla where those pyramidal tracts are going to decussate and then ascend upwards. Perfect. All right. What about this portion here? Olives. Okay, you guys were so ready immediately. Olives. Perfect. So those are our olives. They're called olives because they have this like circular oval structure that makes them look like actual olives. It's not very clear in this diagram, but between the pyramids and the olives, we have this anteromedial sulcus, okay? So it's anterior, it is medial, it is the anteromedial sulcus. After the olives, we're going to have our anterolateral sulcus. So it is still anterior, however, it is more lateral compared to the other one. These are important because we will have the emergence of a lot of cranial nerves within those two sulci. Okay, next up, we have this portion right here. So the pons kind of looks like it has a hair part, in the middle where it, like when its mother would just come and comb its hair, and the in cartoons where they'd lick their hand and just smack it. Basilar groove. Yes, perfect. This is indeed the basilar groove, and this is important for the basilar artery. That is this very large artery where it's going to supply the actual pons itself, and then it is going to give us so many different branches. Okay? All right. Moving on to the posterior view. What are these two tendinous looking structures? Cerebellar peduncles. Exactly. Perfect. It is a peduncle. Yes. So we have three peduncles that are going to connect the brainstem to the cerebellum. Okay. We have the superior, the middle, and the inferior peduncles, each coming from its respective portion of the brainstem. The middle peduncle is the largest one, and it comes from the pons. So this is our middle cerebellar peduncle. Great. Now, what about this bulging here that I was telling you guys is very distinctive for the midbrain? Superior colliculus, perfect. And what about this one? Inferior colliculus, right? Perfect. Now, do you guys know the significance of those colliculi? What are they actually for? One for vision and one for auditory. Yes, perfect. Perfect. Okay. So your eyes are above your ears, so the superior is for vision and the inferior is for hearing. It's the other way around, okay? So because someone said superior is auditory, inferior vision is vision. It's okay. I get them confused as well. So just remember that your eyes are above your ears. So the superior will be for vision, the inferior will be for auditory. Okay. Now I know that my current method might seem like it's a bit too slow and too basic, but I also know that a lot of people really struggle with brainstem, so I want to be sure to start off easy and then gradually build you up to the cranial nerves and all of that so that you can actually be able to correlate everything together and you don't feel too lost. Okay? After Dr. Yaqeen, I'm sure anything is gonna feel slow, but pardon me. So this is for the people that might be facing more difficulty than others. And I was one of them, so there's no shame. It's okay. All right. We've spoken about this, which is our fourth ventricle, right? We've said that it is basically this opening. It's where we have our CSF. It connects to the third ventricle using the aqueduct of Sylvius. And we said this is super important anatomically, and it is a landmark because guys, if you could please stay muted just because there's an echo. Thank you so much. Okay. We said that this is the fourth ventricle. It is super important, and it's an anatomical relation that we should be familiar with just so that we're able to properly locate the brainstem. Okay. Now, posteriorly as well, we can see this structure here highlighted now in very light blue. Could you guys guess what this is? Fasciculus, okay. Gracilis, perfect. All right. Anyone else has any other guesses? Could it be another fasciculus? Cuneatus is more lateral. Perfect. Okay. The medial longitudinal fasciculus, it's amazing that you've brought that up because it is very, very, very high yield. But I will be talking about that when I talk about the cross sections because that's where you can actually see it. You will not be able to see it on gross anatomy like this. Okay, so this is the gracile fasciculus. You guys are absolutely correct. And this is a continuation of the dorsal column tract, specifically the gracile portion, which is the more lateral portion. And then this green portion here is our cuneate fasciculus, which is the more medial portion, and it continues upwards. Okay, so you guys remember the arrangement of the spinal cord where you have the dorsal column tract, and it basically goes from sacral upwards, right? And then you have the others that go the other way around. So just remember that arrangement and then try to correlate that to what we see here. So let's take a closer look at what we actually have within the floor of this fourth ventricle. I want you guys to realize that we have it basically surrounded, right, from everywhere. We have our cerebellar peduncles, we have our midbrain, we have our pons, and this creates this diamond-shaped fossa, which is our rhomboid fossa, okay? This rhomboid fossa is important because we can also note specific features within it. It kind of, to me, looks like abs, you know, like in an abdomen, and I want to remember what each of those signifies. So first of all, let's get familiar with what those lines actually mean, because we need to have borders in which we are containing ourselves. So first of all, this line that runs down the center is a sulcus that is central, so it is the medial sulcus. You can clearly tell I don't like pure memorization, so I will make sense of things that even if they make a lot of sense already. Now, lateral to the medial sulcus is our median protrusion, okay? And because of that, it is called the median eminence. When I'm saying medial, I'm talking about the exact midline, and it is just one structure. If I'm saying median, then it is close to the midline. So this is our median eminence. You guys can see here and here, okay? It is this protrusion that we can see in the midline. Now, the bottom of the median eminence here and the edge of the median eminence are both also significant. We have the medial sulcus medially, and then laterally it's going to have the sulcus limitans because it is limiting how far it can actually go. The terminal portion of this median eminence is going to be something called the facial colliculus. Now, we spoke about the superior and the inferior colliculi, and they are basically those hills, right? So a colliculus is a hill. The facial colliculus is formed by the facial nerve. And what happens is, as we have this nucleus for the sixth cranial nerve, the abducens nucleus, the facial colliculus wants to basically tackle it down, okay? Or if you're aggressive, if you're gonna be super adorable about it, it wants to give it a hug, okay? So it wraps around the facial colliculus and it creates the facial colliculus, sorry, it wraps around the abducens nucleus, creating this bump where we are able to see this right here. Okay, so once again, to recap, we have the medial sulcus that is on the midline. It separates it right to left, okay? And then we have our median eminence, which is basically this bulging on either side. The median eminence is limited laterally by the sulcus limitans, and it's limited inferiorly, or it terminates inferiorly as the facial colliculus. The facial colliculus is this bulging that occurs because the facial nerve loops around the abducens nucleus on its way out. Okay? Moving downwards, now the actual abs here, we have those two triangles and those two triangles. The triangle on top is going to be for our hypoglossal nerve. The triangle on the bottom is going to be for our vagus nerve, okay? So both of those are super important for reasons that we will be talking about later. But consider those bulgings basically like where the nuclei of those cranial nerves are going to be. Now, moving on to the functional anatomy aspect of things. We've looked at the brainstem in like cross sections, let's say, where we've said, okay, we have the midbrain, we have the pons, we have the medulla. We've looked at it anteriorly and posteriorly. Let's look at it from a sagittal section. And now, instead of looking at it as purely just midbrain, pons, and medulla, we can look at it as functional segments. And what I mean by functional segments is each of those segments is going to have different types of fibers going through it, okay? So we can see this huge blue portion here that makes up basically the middle or the bulk of what we're looking at. And it depends on where in the brainstem I'm exactly looking. So for the midbrain, It's going to be in the center. However, as we can see for the pons, it is posterior, and for the medulla, it is also posterior because it doesn't have anything or any room to actually extend since we have the cerebellum here. This fern-like structure is always the cerebellum. So this portion that I'm talking about is called the tegmentum, okay? This tegmentum is important because here is where we are going to have a specific type of tract that we're going to be talking about once I actually discuss the tracts, okay? And typically, do you guys know, can you guess what type of tracts are we going to be seeing? Is it going to be ascending, descending? What are they? Just as a guess, I'm not going to go into details for now. Ascending. Okay, perfect. So in the tegmentum, we would see our ascending tracts or our sensory tracts. And I typically associate sensory with blue and motor with red. That's just how it is in my head. So this makes a lot of sense for it to be blue because this is where we would typically see our ascending tracts. Now, the anterior more portions, including the crus cerebri in our midbrain, the basal portion of the pons and the pons, and finally the pyramids and the medulla are going to be our descending motor tracts. So this tells you that the general functional organization within the brainstem is to have the motor components anteriorly and the sensory components posteriorly. So looking at that, we have the midbrain that has the tectum. This is the dorsalmost portion, and this tectum is basically for the colliculi that we were just talking about. So the superior and the inferior colliculi. Then we're going to have anteriorly the crus cerebri, and this is going to have our descending motor tracts, including corticospinal, corticobulbar, so on and so forth. Moving on to the pons, we will have the tegmentum dorsally, just like throughout the entire brainstem. And then anteriorly, we have the basilar portion. The medulla is going to have the tegmentum dorsally, and finally the pyramids ventrally. Given this arrangement that I've just told you guys about, given everything that we have spoken of, let's look at what the cross sections would look like. I'm not going to be going over the actual nuclei and everything in them for this session. I'll be keeping that to the next session just because to me it makes more sense to take that with the lesions. However, it is important for us to be able to tell what a cross section is and at which level it is. So typically speaking, we cut up at each portion of the brainstem at two levels. So inferior, superior, inferior, superior, inferior, superior. However, there's only one of them that actually has a huge difference between inferior and superior. The others look somewhat similar, so I did not include them. All right, tell me what you guys think this cross section is. I love the three dots. It's very expressive. Pons, okay. Midbrain, midbrain, midbrain. Okay. Walk me through your process. Why are we saying pons? Why are we saying midbrain? I don't mind if you guys want to unmute yourselves. I care so much more about this being actually interactive than about anything else. Because of the colliculus, because of the cerebral aqueduct, okay. There's no fourth ventricle. You guys are absolutely correct, mashallah. You're thinking very, very logically here. However, does this not look almost identical to the spinal cord? Yes. Hmm. So medulla, but there's a cerebral aqueduct. Medulla. Okay. So I understand the confusion. The reason why this looks the way it is, that mimics a hole, is because this is the caudal medulla. So this is the lowermost level of the medulla. This is right before we have the actual fourth ventricle. This is right before we have anything. It looks so much like the spinal cord. It still has a central canal. However, we can see that we have the pyramids anteriorly. And this is typically where we'd have the actual decussation of the pyramids. This isn't what you typically see in a cross-section of the medulla, but this is why I wanted to include it here, because it might be a bit confusing. You'd think, oh, this has to be the midbrain, this has to be the midbrain because I don't see a fourth ventricle. And that is very valid. But the midbrain is going to have a very particular arrangement that we will get to in a second. Is this clear for you guys? Perfect. What about this one? This one should be a bit more of what you guys are accustomed to seeing. Wouldn't it have olives? So the olives are once again slightly higher up. This is, okay, let me just show you where I'm referring to. So looking at, I'm gonna have to go back a lot, but that's fine. All right, just a second. Okay, well, sure, thanks, PowerPoint. So this is what I'm talking about. This is the cross section that I'm taking. It's right here, okay? So the spinal cord, as it immediately becomes the medulla, before I have the fourth ventricle, before I have anything else, before I have the olives popping up, I'm taking a cross section of it right here. And this is significant for me because of the decussation of the pyramids. It looks so much like the spinal cord. However, we have the actual decussation and we have the actual pyramids. So this is the caudal-most portion of the medulla. And this is the one I was referring to and telling you guys that this is the one that is super different. And the pons and the midbrain, everywhere else, they all look somewhat similar, regardless of if you're superior or inferior. It is just the actual nuclei within them that are going to differ slightly. Is that clear? Yes, perfect. Okay. So the olives would be here, okay, and I'm cutting it right here. Okay. I could not find a graph for the life of me that had everything I wanted, so I ended up coloring everything myself. So I apologize if anything is just slightly messy. Okay. So we were at this one. It's not the brainstem. There is no canal or fourth ventricle. Okay, if it's not the brainstem, where in the body might this be? Above midbrain. Okay. Upper medulla, like under the thalamus. Okay. Pons. Okay. Mid-level of medulla. Okay, so we're getting a lot of different views here, which is very, very interesting to me. Pons. Okay. Pons, pons. Okay. All right. The back is the fourth ventricle. Okay, so we're referring to this portion here. I think you can still see. All right, perfect. Okay, so you are correct. The back is the fourth ventricle. That is true. However, this is not the pons because the pons is going to have very chunky cerebellar peduncles on the side. So this is going to be the rostral medulla. Exactly, our upper medulla. Perfect. So this is exactly why I got these sections because we don't usually see them without the nuclei. We just get immediately to memorizing the nuclei and it's like, oh, okay, I just know like as soon as I see a squiggly thing, it's gonna be an olive, it's gonna be this. So this is why I thought it was really important for you guys to be able to just recognize the section that we're looking at first, so that we can then correlate that to the blood supply, we can correlate that to the actual nuclei, we can correlate that to everything else. That doesn't look like a ventricle. This portion here is going to be the ventricle because let me just get my pen 1 second. Okay, so here is basically where the fourth ventricle would be. Okay, this space. Okay, So the reason why there's actually nothing here for me to see is because the medulla just ends, pretty much. It just ends, and then the pons provides this backing for our ventricle. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. So our rostral medulla has the fourth ventricle posteriorly. It has this unique shape where you begin to see the pyramids very evidently here, and you begin to see those protrusions for the cranial nerves that are going to be arising. Okay? What about this one here? There we go. All right, perfect. Everyone immediately got it. It is indeed pons. So looking at pons, we can see what I was telling you guys about, that it provides that backing to the fourth ventricle, and it has those huge lateral projections that are going to be our cerebellar peduncles. Okay? Is that clear? Perfect. Now, obviously, you guys will already know what this one is, but just for the sake of it, what is this one? Midbrain. Perfect. So the midbrain, which you guys were beginning to guess for the caudal medulla, the way that I like to look at it is it's basically like an upside down Mickey Mouse. Don't call me a Disney adult, I will come for you. But it kind of looks like an upside down Mickey Mouse where you'd have the ears here, okay? And what those ears are is the crust cerebri, which we said is the anterior most portion within our midbrain, okay? It looks like superior peduncles, yeah, that's true. And then once we get here, all we see is the aqueduct. So it does have somewhat of a similar arrangement to the spinal cord because we're just going up and we don't have this fourth ventricle anymore. However, we can see this projection outwards that gives it this kind of Mickey Mouse appearance. And we can also see this characteristic darkening that we will not be able to see anywhere else. And this darkening is not actually part of the brainstem, it is part of the basal ganglia. Could you guys guess what that is? Substantia nigra. Perfect. So it is the black substance, basically, or the dark substance. And that is responsible for dopamine, and it is defective in Parkinson's disease. That's beyond the scope of brainstem, but just as a for complacency's sake. Okay, so now we know the parts of the brainstem. Now we know what each of them is supposed to look like on cross section. How is the brainstem actually supplied? What is its blood supply? Well, through the beloved circle of Willis, which a lot of people find very intimidating initially, but I believe it is actually very, very simple and very straightforward. You will have, since we are coming from the spinal cord, okay? Where is the spinal cord? Within the vertebral column. Two vertebral arteries are going to join together, okay? As they do so, each of them gives a branch to contribute to one anterior spinal artery that descends downwards to supply the anterior portion of the spinal cord. If we were to have a defect in this anterior spinal artery, what would we have for the spinal cord? Anterior cord syndrome, where we would basically lose everything except the dorsal column tract, right? These vertebral arteries are also going to give tiny branches, tiny, tiny branches on either side that are going to extend. You can see them here. They're going to extend to the cerebellum. Okay? They're going to extend here to the cerebellum. So since they're moving posteriorly, and since they are the most inferior, then this is going to be the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, because I am going to the cerebellum. Okay? Clear so far? Perfect. So two vertebral arteries, before they join, they're going to give me They will both contribute to a single anterior spinal artery, and they will both give branches for the posterior inferior cerebellar artery that goes back to supply the inferior cerebellum. As they both join together, they will run within the basilar groove of the pons, which is basically that hair part that I was telling you guys about, to become the basilar artery. This basilar artery is this tortuous artery, this very large artery that you can see running right here, and it gives small pontine branches, okay? As it gives those small pontine branches, it remembers, oh, okay, I gave an inferior cerebellar branch, so I have to give a superior cerebellar branch, or else the name would not really make a lot of sense, right? So it gives off superior cerebellar branches. Is that clear? Perfect. Now, as it terminates, it has already supplied everything for the cerebellum. It is already done. It does not care about the cerebellum anymore. It now transcends upwards to the cerebrum. So everything that we're going to be talking about is going to be relating to the cerebrum instead. As it goes up, it bifurcates in its terminal branches to the posterior cerebral arteries. Okay? And those are the terminal branches. I will not be going over the rest of this because that is completely related to the cerebrum, and that is not what we're covering today. But I just want you guys to know, once again, you have two vertebral arteries. Before they join together, they will each contribute to a single spinal artery, which is the anterior spinal artery. And then they will each give a single branch to the inferior portion of the cerebellum known as the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, or the pica. Okay? As they move up, they join together into one basilar artery that runs in the basilar groove of the pons. It will give small pontine branches, and then it will remember, oh, I did not give a superior branch to the cerebellum. So it does that. It gives a superior cerebellar artery. And then as it terminates, it decides to move to the cerebrum instead of the cerebellum, and it gives the posterior cerebral artery. Okay? Now, the basilar artery, aside from just the branches that it's giving to the pons, the pontine branches, it's also going to give a very important branch as soon as it basically joins together, as soon as the vertebral arteries join together, which is the anterior inferior cerebral artery. So everything has to make sense, everything naming wise. Since we said a posterior inferior, we need to have an anterior inferior. So we have our pica and our ica. Okay? Okay. Now, this picture here basically shows you its anatomical relation to everything else, where we have this basilar artery, it's giving its branches, and it's finally transcending up into the cerebrum. Now, I want us to link that back to here. What would this artery be? Anterior spinal, okay. Anyone else? Any other answers? Pontine, okay. All right. So since I have not yet, no, not the green arrow, my pointer. This green arrow I forgot to remove from animations. The green, my pointer, my pointer. Anterior spinal. All right, there we go, perfect. So this would be our anterior spinal. Which two arteries contribute to give me this anterior spinal? Vertebral, great. And before they join together, what are those small branches that they give on either side? Pica, yes, exactly. Now, as they join together, this artery in green that they're going to give me is basilar, perfect. The first branch that we see after they join is Ica, exactly. Anterior, inferior, cerebellar. It's not cerebral, it's cerebellar. Okay. The cerebellum, not the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the one that's higher up. Okay. Why did I keep the basilar one for last? Anyways, then what is this branch here that it remembers that it didn't give? Pica. Okay, so it's not superior inferior. We can't say superior and inferior, that would be counterintuitive. Yes, perfect. So superior cerebellar artery. In the OSPI, make sure you type out the entire thing, okay? And what is its terminal branch at the end here? Posterior cerebral. Perfect. Absolutely perfect, mashallah. Okay. Now, the reason why I only pointed those out specifically is because they are the ones that contribute to the actual blood supply of the brainstem. So let's take a look at it one by one. We start off on top with the midbrain, and then we have the pons, and then we have our medulla. So for each of these, we're going to have a medial blood supply and a lateral blood supply. So I want you guys to think back to the anatomical position of everything, where we had the pons right here, right? We had it here. And then we had our midbrain here, and we had our medulla right here, right? So I want you guys to link that back, and that's why I placed those where they are. So for our midbrain, medially, the medial aspect of the midbrain right here, it's going to be supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Okay? But because the midbrain is actually so tiny and because the posterior cerebral artery is so large, it will also supply the lateral portion. So the entire midbrain is going to be supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Moving down to the pons, what would make the most sense for it to be supplied by medially? Basilar, exactly. So the medial aspect of it is going to be supplied entirely by the basilar artery, either its pontine branches or the artery itself. However, laterally, since the pons is so large, you see those projections here that are going to wrap around? This ICA is going to give me the lateral blood supply of the pons. Okay, so far so good. Are we clear? All right. Moving down finally to the medulla. The medulla is right here. What would supply the center of it medially? It's right here. Anterior spinal. Perfect. And then laterally, it would be supplied by pica. Okay? So since the midbrain is so tiny, and since the PCA is so large, it only requires one. However, the pons and the medulla, think back to the actual relations that you had. Think back to the other structures that you were seeing. Since the pons is here, the medial aspect of it would be the basilar artery. And then as we move more laterally, we would see our anterior inferior cerebellar. The medulla medially would be the anterior spinal. And as we move laterally, we would see the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Now, why is this as much of an issue? Because since it is only one blood supply, then if we affect this artery, we're basically destroying the entire midbrain, right? We're not just destroying the medial or the lateral aspects. And we're also affecting the cerebrum, since this is a cerebral artery. For the others, we have this sort of compensation, right? Where we have a different medial versus a different lateral. So you will not expect to see that everything is damaged. For the midbrain, when we look at the lesions, you will see that rather than talking about medial and lateral, we will be talking about the tegmentum and the tectum, so on and so forth. Is that clear for everyone so far? All right, perfect. Okay, now the beloved spinal cord, which you guys, I am sure, remember a lot better than I do. we have our ascending tracts and we have our descending tracts. Our descending tracts are going to carry the efferent fibers, which are responsible for the motor sensations, right? The motor functions, let's say. Our sensory fibers, our afferent fibers, are our ascending tracts. So ascending for afferent. These will go upwards to the thalamus. They'll relay there, then they'll go to the cortex. They'll tell the cortex, oh, I'm feeling this specific type of thing. What am I supposed to do? Then the cortex will respond, send back the descending tract to actually perform the function. So our sensory ascending tracts, we have the dorsal column tract, the spinocerebellar tracts, and I think, and the dorsal column medial lemniscus is the one that I just mentioned. So yeah, those are the ones that they're focusing on the most. And those are the ones that we will be looking at the most as well for the brainstem. So you have the dorsal column tract and the spinocerebellar tract. Okay? For the descending pathways, you're going to have your pyramidal and your extrapyramidal tracts. Your pyramidal tracts are your corticospinal. Your extrapyramidal include your rubrospinal, reticulospinal, olivospinal, which are more about like flexion and extension. Meanwhile, the corticospinal is for more fine movement. Now, for sensory, you guys remember very well, right, what each one carries. So what does the dorsal column tract carry? It's three things, and I want them in a very specific order. Two-touch discrimination, okay, that's one. Vibration and conscious proprioception, perfect. What about the spinocerebellar tracts? Unconscious proprioception, perfect. So as soon as I'm talking about something cerebellar, then I am talking about something that has to do with balance, something that has to do with coordination. And finally, we have our spinothalamic tracts. What is the lateral spinothalamic tract for? Pain. Lateral is pain and temperature, yes. And anterior is for crude touch and pressure. Perfect. Absolutely wonderful, mashallah. Great job, you guys. Okay. So now we know all of those very well. We know what they're like in the spinal cord, but what do they actually look like moving up? How do they actually transform? We know that most of the sensory tracts are actually going to decussate within the spinal cord itself, including the spinothalamic tract, right? Where we have our third order neurons, and then we have this nucleus within the spinal cord itself, giving us our second order neurons. And then finally, within the thalamus, we have our first order neurons. Okay. So this type of arrangement is going to be very important when we're talking about the different types of lesions, when we're talking about the different types of strokes that might happen. And you want to remember that spinothalamic tract, as long as I am above the level of the spinal cord, it will be contralateral. For the dorsal column tract, however, it does not actually decussate within the spinal cord. It descends upwards and then it decussates within the medulla, within something known as the medial lemniscus, which you will be able to see as this sort of protrusion on the medial aspect of our medulla. And this is why it is called the medial lemniscus. So if a decussation, I want you guys to take this basically as a rule. If the decussation does not occur at the level of the spinal cord for spinal tracts, I'm talking about spinal tracts, if it does not happen at the level of the spinal cord, then it will happen at the level of the medulla. Okay? So the dorsal column tract does not decussate at the level of the spinal cord. It's going to go up within the medulla. It is going to decussate. It's going to have its second order neuron, and then it is going to move up to the thalamus, have its third order neuron, so on and so forth. Is that clear? And once we go over the cross sections as well, I will be explaining all of that again. Perfect. Now, our descending or motor tracts are slightly different because now we're no longer just talking about things coming from the spinal cord, right? We're talking about we want to relay things back down. We want to be able to actually communicate again. So let's look at the ones that we do have from the spinal cord. First of all, we have the corticospinal tract. You guys, those are negligible. The anterior spinal tract, the fact that it does not decussate right away, and the fact that the lateral has some portion of it that does not decussate. It's not like it's a very intricate detail. I wanted to include it in the graph just in case. However, what you really need to know and remember is that the corticospinal tract will also not decussate until it reaches the medulla, once again, where it will have this pyramidal decussation. It will move to the other side, and thus anything that we have, once again, within the brainstem is going to be for the contralateral aspect. Is that clear? So looking at the actual pathway, we're going to have our first order neurons that arise from the cerebrum. They're going to descend down from the ventral aspect, so the anterior-most aspect of the brainstem. They will decussate within the caudal medulla, so the most, like the bottommost portion of the medulla, and then they will continue descending back the contralateral side after this decussation. Is that clear? So this is all our first order neuron. This entire process is our first order neuron. The one doing this entire decussation is the first order neuron. It is within the spinal cord, within the substantia gelatinosa, that it has another synapse where it's going to actually move into the second order neuron. And you guys can see that here in this graph where we have this purple here that comes down all the way straight until we reach the medulla. This first order neuron will decussate, move down the spinal cord, and then within the substantia gelatinosa, within the nucleus of the substantia gelatinosa, it's going to synapse with its second order neuron and then give the actual supply as a second order neuron. Is that clear? Would you like me to repeat that? Would you guys like me to repeat anything? I'm not sure if there's a connection issue. All clear. Perfect. Okay. Now, the corticospinal tract, I'm not talking about the extrapyramidal ones, obviously, they're going to have their own arrangements as well. But talking about very large, prominent tracts, they're not the only ones that are going to be descending from the cortex. We want messages to actually also be able to reach the pons. We want messages to be able to reach the cerebellum, right? And those messages that reach the cerebellum, since it has this very close relation to the pons, are called the corticopontine. Okay? So corticospinal means it comes from the cortex and has a nucleus within the spinal cord. Corticopontine means it comes from the cortex and then it has a nucleus within the pons. So the first order neurons that you guys can see here in red are going to come down and then they're going to synapse within the pons. Afterwards, they will decussate. Okay, so this is after they have reached their nucleus. They will decussate and give me the second order neurons that move to the cerebellum, the contralateral cerebellum. So the difference here is that the corticospinal tract decussates before it reaches the nucleus, while the corticopontine tract is going to decussate after it actually synapses. So the corticospinal, the first order neuron is the one that decussates. Corticopontine, the second order neuron is the one that decussates. And as it does so, it goes to the cerebellum. As this corticospinal tract does so, it actually goes to the spinal cord. Is that clear? Because some people told me they were having issues with this portion. Could you repeat corticopontine? Absolutely. So corticopontine fibers, from their name, arise within the cortex and they will synapse in the pons. So those fibers are descending their motor tracts. And for every single motion that we do as humans, our brain wants to be sure that we're coordinating. So it wants to make sure that I'm able to have this unconscious proprioception, right? It wants to make sure that I'm able to show myself how far something is. I'm able to coordinate my movement so that I don't like slap myself in the face randomly. So those tracts need to be able to reach to the cerebellum. These are motor tracts, and the way that they do so is basically through the pons because of the very, very close relation of the cerebellum to the pons. What happens is our first order neurons, so the ones that arise immediately from the cortex, are going to descend down through the cortex. Okay, they descend down, and then as they reach the pons, they will have a nucleus where they will synapse. After the synapse, you will have the second order neurons arising. The second order neurons are going to decussate to the other side. They're going to cross over to the contralateral side, and then they are going to supply the cerebellum of this contralateral side. Okay? Does that make sense? Perfect. Okay. So the difference that I was talking about is that the decussation, or this flipping over to the other side, within corticospinal, it happens in our first order neurons. So I am not yet at a nucleus. I am nowhere. I'm just suddenly in the caudal medulla, in the pyramids, where I have this decussation, and then I go down. So I have not met a single nucleus at any point. For corticopontine, it is after the nucleus that I actually have this decussation and it goes to the other side. So a rule of thumb that you guys can remember is that the cortex, everything within the cortex is flipped. Okay, so everything within the cerebrum is flipped. If I'm talking about the left hemisphere, it's supplying the right side of the body. If I'm talking about the right hemisphere, then it is supplying the left side of the body. Is that clear? So at some point in time, I will have to have a decussation. And for the cerebellum, it will always be for the same side of the body. It is always ipsilateral. So the right side of the cerebellum will refuse to receive signals if they are not about the right side of the body. And for that, although I am receiving signals from the left cerebrum, they have to switch over and go to the right cerebellum. And the opposite is also true. Is that clear for everyone? Perfect. Okay. Okay. Now, lastly, why would corticospinal synapse add substantia gelatinosa? Okay. So it synapses within substantia gelatinosa, and that per pain and temperature. Am I remembering it incorrectly? I think I'm remembering it incorrectly, and you're correct. But it is within the spinal cord. I'll change this. It's another nucleus within the spinal cord. I think that is true. Yes. Just as a heads up, I did basically this entire presentation from memory. So that does check out. I'll be sure to correct that. Okay. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. Any other questions? Is that clear for everyone? All right. Lastly, we are going to have the tracts that communicate the cranial nerves to the cortex, which is where a lot of people find difficulty as well. Even though the only one that you actually really need to focus on, like the first order, second order, all of that, is for the facial nerve, just because it has a very unique orientation. Aside from that, just think of it as the fact that every cranial nerve will supply the ipsilateral side. Okay, so they will all supply the ipsilateral side. Every single one, every cranial nerve supplies the ipsilateral side of the body. And so what that means is that the second order neurons are going to not be the ones that are decussating, right? That kind of makes sense. When I'm talking about something that's arising from the nucleus, supplying the ipsilateral side, then if I'm going to have a decussation, it has to be within the first order neurons that are coming down to the nucleus. Does that make sense? You're confused. Okay. Think of it this way. I am now saying that everything that a cranial nerve supplies is for the ipsilateral side. It supplies the same side that the nerve is coming from. Okay, so it's somewhat similar to how we have in the cerebellum. Everything is the same side, right? However, we know that cranial nerves are just going to come out of where they're from and go immediately to their target, except for one cranial nerve that I'll be talking about. But they just go to their target from the nucleus immediately. So because of that, it should not decussate as a second order neuron, especially if I'm talking about the descending tracts right now. Okay? Since the second order neuron arises from that nucleus and goes to the site of action, since it is ipsilateral, it should not arise, this decussation, from the second order neuron. Instead, because I want to communicate with the contralateral side of the cerebrum, the decussation is going to be within our first order neurons. Is that clear? Perfect. Okay. All right. Now moving on to the actual cranial nerves. If you guys would like, we can take a break here because either way, I prepared like an actual break slide in a couple of minutes. But the way that I had it was that we'd start off with just talking about the actual functions of all of them, and then before the nuclei, we would take a break. If you would rather we take a break now, that's also completely okay. All of what we were just talking about is introductory. So if you'd prefer to take a break now, then we could do that. Continue. Okay. Anyone else? Would you like me to continue or should we take a short break? Continue. Okay. Keep going. All right. The cranial nerves are a set of 12 nerves that arise within the cranium. And what that means is that they basically are within the skull. The second you pass the foramen magnum, you no longer have cranial nerves. You have C1 roots. You have actual like vertebral nerves arising basically. Okay, so C1, C2, C3, so forth, so on and so forth. However, as long as we are actually in the cranium, we're within the skull, then we will be referring to cranial nerves. Those cranial nerves are able to carry out various different functions, okay? So each cranial nerve is not specific to just one function. However, nuclei are specific to one function. So that can get your gears ticking of, okay, since one specific cranial nerve does not necessarily need to only perform one function, however, one nucleus does have to only have one function, then certain cranial nerves will have multiple nuclei to be able to fulfill each of their functions. And if you did not understand that now, I will be going over it multiple times again, so don't worry. Now, there are so many mnemonics about how to memorize the cranial nerves, about how to actually know everything about them. This one is for their names and this one is for their functions. Me personally, I did not use any of them. They just seemed like a hassle to memorize the mnemonic itself, and I was able to memorize the actual nerves alone much easier. However, the one mnemonic that I did actually use was this one, which I will be showing you guys. And it is where you draw out everything. So you start off with number one, which is going to be the nose. And then after number one, we have our eyes. So we have two eyes. And we have three, which is going to give me my eyebrows. I'm sure some of you have already seen this somewhere, but it personally helped me. Okay? Now, after three, we have four on the inner corners of the eye. We have five for the entire face. We have six on the outer corners of the eye. Seven for the entire face once again. Eight as the ears. Nine as the mouth. 10 here. This is already the one. Okay, so this is 0. 10 here. 11 is going to give me my shoulders. And then 12 is going to go right here inside this tongue. All right. So this looks like a huge mess. But if you were able to actually remember this, personally, it helped me out a lot. So let's take a look at what each of these things mean. One is our olfactory. So it goes to the nose. Two is our optic nerve, so it goes to the eyes. Three is giving me my eyebrows because it basically surrounds the eye all the way around and it gives me the motor supply of the eye. So it's oculomotor. All right. Now, four is on the inner corners of the eye because it controls the muscle that is responsible for bringing your eye inwards, so medially, and downwards. And this nerve has this hook that it basically hooks onto before it goes to the eye, and that hook is called the trochlea. And it's because of that that we have the name of the trochlear nerve. Five goes all the way around the face, and this is our trigeminal. Six, as you guys can see, is on the corners of the eye. So what is it going to do? It's going to help me abduct my eye. So it is called the abducens because it helps with abduction. Seven is also all the way over the face, and it actually gives me the entire face. And this is going to be my facial. Eight is giving me my ears. So what, if you guys remember from high school, what is within the ear that kind of looks like a snail? It's called the cochlea, right? That's important for hearing and for balance. And then we have the vestibule within the ear, as you guys will take later in HNS. That is also supplied by this. So this is the vestibulocochlear. Okay. Now, nine, we have here drawing our mouth, and this nine is going to give supply, first of all, to the tongue, and second of all, to a muscle in the pharynx. So because of that, it is going to be called the glossopharyngeal. All right. 10 is our vagabond. So it is the one that like does it all. It's a 10 out of 10. And because it's a vagabond, it is the vagus nerve. 11 gives me those shoulders. Okay. So you can see that it's going to go down the spine, and it's also where you can wear your necklaces, right, on your shoulders. So it's the accessory. Spinal. Now, last but not least, we have the 12 within the tongue, and that is because the 12 is going to give me my supply to the tongue, and that is our hypoglossal. All right? Is that clear for everyone? Would anyone like me to repeat the mnemonic? Because I didn't really like the other ones, so this one made the most sense to me. Any questions, you guys? Want me to repeat anything? All clear. All right, perfect. Okay, so I actually included all of this for you guys in the actual slide. I was going to draw out basically the entire lecture, but I wasn't sure how I'd be able to give you the slides then. So I resorted to like trying a mix of both. All right. So this really helped me personally, and it's based on this that you can correlate the name of each. Olfaction is the sense of smell, so it is the olfactory, and then optic is for seeing. So that's how you would correlate all of them. And here I've put the actual number of the nerve to correlate it with the picture. Now, what are the cranial nerves actually numbered based upon? Because if you were to look at them, they'd look a bit haphazard. They might not necessarily be in a correct order. So what are they based upon? They are based upon where they exit within the cranial cavity. By the way, they exit, yes, perfect. I'm sorry, just give me 1 second. My cat wants to leave. Just all right. So it is by the way that they exit the cranial cavity. And how I personally remember this is starting off, although it might be a bit like not conventional, is starting from foramen ovale, surprisingly, because it is the one that your eyes will immediately navigate towards. As soon as you see it, you're like, okay, I can see this one. It looks like an oval. I can very clearly know what it is. And going from foramen ovale, you can see that laterally to it and medially to it, you will have two openings. One of them looks like a spine, so this is foramen spinosum. And then one of them is kind of like a rat hole opening. So it is foramen rotundum. Okay. This foramen rotundum lies super close to an oblique sort of foramen. And it's not necessarily a foramen if you were to actually see it on the skull. It kind of has this rough texture because it's the passage of so many different things. And as they course through it, they leave their own markings against it. This is the superior orbital fissure. And its name is important because you would see that it goes superiorly and above the eyeball. Okay? So it is the superior orbital fissure. Now, medial to the superior orbital fissure, and in a very unique place that I'll be showing you guys within the next slide as well, it kind of looks like an eye of a frog. If you guys know the forest frog, the one with red eyes, the super tiny one, it kind of looks like the eyes of a frog. And because of that, I was able to remember that it is the optic canal. All right. Now, lastly, here we have this roughened edge that is called the cribriform plate. This here is where we're going to have the passage of the olfactory nerve. And this is where the first nerve passes, and that is why it is called nerve number 1. Okay? Moving down from the foramen ovale, if you were to just go immediately posterior to it, you would be able to see behind this petrous portion of the temporal bone, this opening that is almost exactly where the ear would be. And that is because it is the internal acoustic meatus. So when I'm talking about something that is acoustic, then I'm referring to something relating to the ear. After that, a bit inferiorly as well, not just posteriorly, you will see a large kind of curved opening that is the jugular foramen. And this is where we have our jugular vein, which is very, very, very important because it is the sole venous supply of our brain. Lastly, you will have this tiny opening right here, which is the hypoglossal canal. And if we were to look at all of those here, you can see why I told you to start from the foramen ovale, right? It is very oval, it's very obvious, you can very clearly see it. And then as you go anteriorly and medially, you can see the foramen rotundum. As you go posteriorly and laterally, you can see the foramen spinosum. There's also the foramen lacerum, which is an important landmark for you to know, but it does not have the passage of any of the cranial nerves. Now, imagine this. I'm going to try to draw this out actually, because I don't think anyone would really be able to see what I'm referring to. But imagine this as a frog. This is those are its lips, okay? And it comes out like this. And then those two here are its eyes. Does that make sense for anyone? Do you see it? All right, perfect. So it is because of those two that we see here that this is called the optic, right? Because it's like the eyes. This is the optic canal. When we moved even more anteriorly, we saw this roughened edge that is known as the cribriform plate. Now moving posteriorly, immediately posterior to the foramen ovale, where the ear would be, we have our internal acoustic meatus. And then posterior to that, a huge curved foramen, the jugular foramen. And then right next to the foramen magnum, we have our hypoglossal canal, which is super small. Now, based on those markings that I just told you guys about, we will have the cranial nerves arising. So the cribriform plate, going in order from anterior to posterior, will have the first cranial nerve. The optic canal is for the optic nerve, and then the superior orbital fissure is for where we have anything that is going to the eye. So which nerves are going to the eye? We have the third nerve, oculomotor. We have the fourth nerve, trochlear, and the sixth nerve, which is the abducens, all responsible for movements around the eye. However, it wouldn't really make sense if we were to say, okay, so we have 3, 4, and 6, then how does this apply? The fact that they're named based on where they exit. That's because our trigeminal nerve, which is the fifth cranial nerve, actually has 3 separate components and 3 roots. The first root of it is the ophthalmic root, which is also relating to the eye. So it exits in the superior orbital fissure alongside everything else, and it actually comes out above the abducens nerve. So although it is not the entire trigeminal that you guys can see here, this huge root, it is the anterior-most portion, which is the ophthalmic, and this is V1, V for 5. Next up, we have our foramen rotundum that I told you guys kind of looks like a rat hole, right? This foramen rotundum that is also rounded, so a rotundum, is going to be for our V2. Now we want to finish up all of the roots that we have before we are actually able to move to saying, okay, this is cranial nerve 7 or 8. We want to finish up our fifth cranial nerve. So in foramen rotundum, we will have our maxillary branch of trigeminal, which is V2. And then in foramen ovale, we have our mandibular branch, which is V3. All right, we finished everything that I was telling you guys about from foramen ovale going anteriorly, which is also why I did it this way and not just like the both ways, because you can see that foramen ovale is our cutoff point, right? Now moving down from it, after the spiculous part of the temporal bone, we had our internal acoustic meatus. Since this is acoustic, it's going to the ear. Obviously, which nerve do we need to have here? Our vestibulocochlear nerve, or our eighth cranial nerve. But once again, it would not make sense otherwise. So we need to also have our facial nerve, our seventh cranial nerve. And in HNS, you will take in detail the actual passage of the facial nerve, where it goes, its relation to the cochlea and the vestibule, so on and so forth. Moving posteriorly, we have this jugular foramen that has our three of the remaining cranial nerves. So we had 8 already done. We have 9, 10, and 11. The reason for that is the hypoglossal canal is super tiny, and it's called the hypoglossal. So the hypoglossal nerve is like, nah, I don't want to share with anyone. I'm going to go out here on my own. So we've already said internal acoustic meatus and hypoglossal. So we have an acoustic for 8, and we have a hypoglossal for 12. So everything in between is going to go through jugular. So we're going to have 9, 10, and 11. Is that clear? Do you guys have any questions? Clear. All right, perfect. Perfect. Okay. Now, for the actual functions of each of the cranial nerves, this is unfortunately something that is slightly memorization heavy, but I tried my best to categorize it based on motor, sensory, and parasympathetic components, as well as their anatomical parts. So I am like sprinkling in a bit of the rule of fours here, which we will be talking about a lot more heavily and in detail in our next session, inshallah. But we have 4 cranial nerves above the pons. So just above the pons, not necessarily all within the midbrain. Okay? Our olfactory and our optic nerve actually do not go to the brainstem. The optic nerve loops around it, but it does not go to it or through it. Both of them exit directly from the brain and go to their targets. While the olfactory nerve, that is going to be the olfactory bulb, which is for the nose. For the optic nerve, it is going to be the eye directly. And both of those nerves are very straightforward. One is for smell and one is for sight. It seems like an easy mission, but there's a lot that goes into that, because imagine all the different smells that we're able to actually detect and all the different sights that we're, alhamdulillah, blessed enough to see. Our third cranial nerve is in the midbrain alongside the trochlear nerve. So cranial nerves 3 and 4 are both within the midbrain of the brainstem. The oculomotor, from its name, it's going to supply the motor supply to the muscles of the eye. So all of the muscles of the eye that move it around are going to be supplied by the oculomotor, except for 2. Why is that? Well, we said that the cranial nerve number 4 and cranial nerve number 6 also supply muscles of the eye. So each of them is going to claim one as its own. And for that, the oculomotor nerve gives them up. And it's like, okay, I will not be supplying those 2. It supplies everything else though. And then it says, okay, you took something from me, so I will take something else. I'm going to be taking another component as well. What it takes is the parasympathetic to the pupil to constrict it. So if you're in a rest and digest state, you don't really need to be seeing much, right? You're just relaxing, you're vibing. You don't have to have very dilated pupils that are able to see everything all at once. So what happens is that the oculomotor nerve through the ciliary ganglion, it's going to go to the ciliary ganglion, okay, and then it will tell it, okay, this is parasympathetic, constrict. And the short ciliary nerves will go to the ciliary muscle, tell the pupil to actually constrict, and in that you'll be able to see the function of the oculomotor nerve when you actually test with a light, for example. Our fourth cranial nerve is the trochlear nerve. The trochlear nerve is once again within the brainstem. It is in the midbrain, and it exits alongside the oculomotor through the superior orbital fissure. The trochlear nerve is going to claim one of those muscles that the oculomotor nerve gave up, which is the superior oblique. So SO4, remember it like that. Superior oblique is responsible for moving the eye downwards and medially. So basically imagine yourself crossing your eyes and looking at your nose. That is what the trochlear nerve is responsible for. It is only one nerve for one muscle. Then we have 4 cranial nerves within the pons. All right, those four are going to be 5, 6, 7, and 8. Cranial nerve number 5 is our trigeminal nerve. It has a huge root. It's very, very, very large, huge nucleus, huge nerve, and it divides into three, which is our V1, the ophthalmic, the highermost, which goes alongside 3 and 4 through the superior orbital fissure. We have V2, which goes through the foramen rotundum, and this is our maxillary nerve. And then V3, the only nerve coming out of the brain from the back. Yes, absolutely correct. The trochlear nerve is the only nerve that comes out posteriorly and then it loops around. You're absolutely correct. The trigeminal, I was talking about V3, which is the mandibular portion, and that is going to exit through foramen ovale. Now, the function of the trigeminal nerve is almost fully sensory. So it's for everything on the face. The only motor, and it's a very, very tiny nucleus, the only motor supply that it gives is for the muscles of mastication. So for chewing. That is for the trigeminal nerve. Everything else is going to be a sensory sort of supply. It does not have parasympathetic, it does not have anything else. It's mainly sensory. Okay? The sensation that it provides are either just the actual like two-touch discrimination, vibration, conscious proprioception, all that, and it actually also has a special type of sensation, which we'll be talking about later. Okay. Our sixth cranial nerve is the abducens nerve. The abducens nerve is responsible for abduction of the eye, so abduction. It exits through the superior orbital fissure alongside cranial nerves 3, 4, and V1, and it's going to supply the lateral rectus. So think of it this way, something is lateral, it's pulling laterally, it's going to contribute to abduction, all right? Next up, we have our facial nerve. The facial nerve is once again within the pons. It exits through the internal acoustic meatus with the vestibulocochlear nerve. And this nerve is just select all. It has motor, it has sensory, and it has parasympathetic. It went basically to the trigeminal. It was like, oh, you dare take from what I'm supposed to do? I'm mainly motor, right? I'm supplying all the muscles of facial expressions. How are you taking motor from me? So what are you doing? You're supplying the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. I will also do that, but I will be taking the taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So this is the special sensation. All right. So the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, the normal sensation is going to be through trigeminal, but the special sensation of taste is going to be through the facial nerve. Lastly, the facial nerve is like, I'm not even done here. You thought facial and trigeminal are besties. Listen, in neural, I think everyone has beef with each other. I think everything is just because you're already in fight or flight during the block, so I think that's why. Like preparing for this, I immediately was having a battle, just immediately. Okay. So the facial nerve says, I'm not only going to do motor and sensory, you know what? I'm going to listen. The oculomotor knew what it was doing. I'm also going to give parasympathetic. Its parasympathetic supply is going to be to the lacrimal gland for tearing up because it's like, you guys are upsetting me. I'm going to cry. And you know what? I'm also going to eat a lot of sweets. So for that, you need to supply the lacrimal gland and you need to supply the salivary glands to produce a lot of saliva to be able to digest those sugars that you're eating. Okay? I'm trying to help with memorization. Then the cranial nerve 8, which is the vestibulocochlear nerve, very straightforward. It's in the pons, it's for hearing and balance. So it has a vestibular portion and a cochlear portion, vestibular for balance, cochlear for hearing. Lastly, we have 4 cranial nerves below the pons. And in this case, they are all in the medulla. So I'm not going to tell you there doesn't necessarily mean they're all in the brainstem. They are all in the medulla. We have our 9th cranial nerve, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve. We have our 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus, the 11th, which is spinal accessory, and the 10th, which is hypoglossal. The 9th cranial nerve is basically a nerve that wanted to try it all. Okay? It was, I don't know why, but I just feel like it's an actual 9-year-old that's super curious about things. So it was like, I want to try what it's like to be motor, but not really, not a lot. I'll just do it once. I'm gonna try what it's like to be sensory, but not for the whole thing, just a bit. And I'm gonna try to be parasympathetic, but not for everything, just for one. So that is the glossopharyngeal nerve. It takes one muscle for motor supply. It takes only the 1/3 of the tongue, and it takes only one salivary gland for parasympathetic. So it's one, one, and one. All right? It's motor to the stylopharyngeus muscle. It's sensory to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue for both taste and sensations. And it is parasympathetic to the parotid gland through the otic ganglion. All right? Then we have our vagus nerve, our vagabond, the one that is basically like the pro at everything, right? So the vagus nerve is going to come and pick up where the glossopharyngeal nerve left off. It's going to come supply the rest of the muscles of the pharynx and larynx. It's going to give sensation to the root of the tongue that the glossopharyngeal did not want to cover. And then it's going to dip down and continue to all the viscera. So it's going to go to the CVP, it's going to go to your GIT, it's going to go everywhere. And it's going to give the parasympathetic supply. So it does not give parasympathetic to the head and neck. However, it gives all the parasympathetic supply to the viscera. Our 11th cranial nerve is the spinal accessory nerve. The spinal accessory nerve has two portions. The one that you really need to worry about for the sake of testing and so on is the portion that goes down to supply the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscles, both of which are mainly responsible for you turning your head to the side. So if a patient was not able to do that on either side, then you would suspect that there's an issue with the spinal accessory nerve. Lastly, the hypoglossal nerve that wants nothing to do with anyone, it went on its own through the hypoglossal canal. All it does is it goes to the tongue, gives motor supply. Everyone is fighting over the sensory. They're like, oh yeah, you take that, you take that, you take that. 5, 7, 9, and 10 are all fighting for the sensory supply. I'm just gonna do motor. All on my own. I'm gonna take care of the motor supply of the tongue. And that's it. Are those clear? Are those functions clear for everyone? 9 and 12 are siblings in your head. 9 would be the younger sibling immediately. All right. Now, let's talk about the things that are frequently confused. And I personally wanted to just shoot myself in the back of the head when I was going through these. So let me tell you a very simple way to remember them. When I'm talking about a parasympathetic supply, parasympathetic is rest and digest, right? It is something that is like super slow, it's super restful. So because of that, all of the second order neurons are going to arise just a bit before where they're supposed to act because it's lazy. Unlike the sympathetic, where it's immediately like I'm fight or flight, so the second order neuron is like give it to me right now, give it to me. So it's super, super close to where the nerve actually arises from. So I need to have a nucleus that is close to the site of action that is going to give me the second order neurons, which will actually be able to work on this portion. Okay? So what happens is that I start off with the nucleus within the brainstem, which we will be talking about those nuclei separately later. The nerve comes out, so let's start off by talking about the third cranial nerve, which is right here, okay? The nerve is going to come out and it's going to go to what is known as the ciliary ganglion. The ciliary ganglion will then give short ciliary nerves to the ciliary muscle, and that is why it is called the way that it is, okay? So the ciliary ganglion will supply the ciliary muscle to cause our pupillary constriction. Next up, who else had a parasympathetic supply? Our trigeminal, right? Or was it our facial? Which one is it, you guys? Which one of those two that had beef together? Facial. Perfect. Yes. So it's because the trigeminal took from facial motor that facial decided to go all around, right? So the facial nerve actually overcompensates and it has two separate ganglions or ganglia. The first one, as I told you guys, it's going to be crying and eating sweets. So the first one will go to the lacrimal gland, and the way that it does that is through what is known as the pterygopalatine ganglion. It is called this way not because of its function, but rather because of its location that you will be taking in more detail in HNS. Secondly, you want to eat a lot of sweets, you need a lot of saliva, so you will have the submandibular ganglion that goes to supply both the submandibular and the sublingual glands. Okay. Next up, we had the glossopharyngeal nerve that wanted to try everything out. It wanted something from everything. What it does is it goes to the otic ganglion. This otic ganglion will give supplies to the parotid gland. So otic, parotid, try to like link the two together. And because of that, we will have this salivation as well. Lastly, we have our vagus nerve. Our vagus nerve is going to go and supply all of the viscera. So you're going to have multiple ganglia all where we actually have that specific organ. So I'm not going to have a ganglion for a colon where the lungs are, for example. So you will have a separate ganglion for each of these. Now for the tongue, this diagram is a bit helpful where you see that the sensory supply is the one that's a bit of an issue, right? You're gonna have the posterior 1/3 for both sensation and taste be by the glossopharyngeal. However, the anterior 2/3, which is the larger portion, are going to have separate supplies for taste and for sensation. For sensation, it is going to be through trigeminal, while for taste, it is going to be through facial. For motor, just remember it is the hypoglossal. There's one specific muscle that's not by hypoglossals, but it's fine. It's just one nerve, and that's okay. Is that clear? If you guys don't ask me, I'm gonna ask you because we're at a review slide. Okay. It seems that there are no questions. So let us say that someone, I don't want you to like go through too much now of lesions. I'm just gonna tell you, someone is having an issue with salivation, okay? And they're having an issue with like they're basically not being able to swallow very well. So dysphagia, dizzy. Okay, so they're not able to swallow very well. What is the nerve that might be affected in this case? Glossopharyngeal and facial. 7, 9, facial. Okay. Why facial and why glossopharyngeal? 9 and 10. Okay. Because of motor. Okay. So glossopharyngeal supplies parotid glands and muscles of the pharynx. They will supply pharynx and larynx. Okay. Stylopharyngeus. Okay. So why facial? Because some of you guys were saying facial. Facial for salivation. Okay. So I really like that you guys are trying your best to be very inclusive. And you're absolutely correct. Facial does usually get damaged if I'm talking about salivation. And vagus is usually damaged when I'm talking about dysphagia. However, if I have both of those together, let me try to think before I say that I have multiple different lesions. Let me try to think, can one lesion have both of those presentations? Because we have glossopharyngeus as well for the base of the tongue, right? We have it for the posterior one third of the tongue. And it's for one of the muscles of the pharynx. So our glossopharyngeal nerve is going to be responsible for this. And typically, you guys are right, the vagus would also be affected. But for the sake of the review, let's look at it this way. Okay, let's say that someone has their eye, cranial nerve 9 affects salivation. Yes, it does because it supplies the parasympathetic supply to the parotid gland. And the parotid gland is actually the one that contributes the most amount of saliva. So the patient would typically present with a dry mouth. It's not completely dry because you still have the submandibular and the sublingual producing saliva from facial, but they will have a more like a drier mouth than usual. Sure thing. Okay. So let's say that your patient's eye, this is the nose, is like this. Okay, this is where the pupil is. This person does not have a pupil. 6 lesion. Perfect. Okay, the abducens nerve. So this is abducens. Perfect. All right. I think I should probably change colors so it doesn't get confusing. Let's go through one more. Let's say that the patient opens their mouth. Okay, they open, this is their mouth. And then their tongue, instead of going straight, it protrudes to the side like this. 12. Why not 5, 7, 9, or 10? Don't they all supply the tongue? Motor. Muscle of the tongue is 12. Perfect. Great job, you guys. Absolutely great job, mashallah. 5 is facial, except 9. Yes. Okay. Let me give you one more with just symptoms rather than a drawing. Let's say, okay, a patient comes to you complaining that, so this was number 1, this was number 2, this was number 3. A patient comes to you complaining of, yeah, there's so much that can go wrong. Okay, they tell you that they have dry eyes and they tell you they have hmm, okay. What would this one be alone if it's just dry eyes? Facial, okay. Ophthalmic, okay. Ophthalmic of trigeminal, okay. So ophthalmic of trigeminal, we're talking about V1. V1 is for sensation. 7 is lacrimal. Yes, absolutely. So cranial nerve number 7 is going to give me lacrimation and salivation. So you know, you guys get the point. I'm zoning out, but you get the point. So they'd also, yes, absolutely, they would have a dry mouth. I was gonna say dry eyes and dry mouth, but I would have given it away. But yes, they would also have a dry mouth, yes. Okay, the last one, actually this time, is that a patient comes to you, their eyelid is somewhat closed, and their skin is dry. And then their pupil is constricted. 3, trigeminal. Okay. Trochlear. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's very interesting seeing all the different guesses. Any other guesses? So we've gotten trochlear, we've gotten trigeminal. It's not clicking for you, completely understandable. We've gotten trochlear, we've gotten trigeminal, we've gotten oculomotor. Okay, so let's work through the process of each. This is what I think you guys probably thought of, and then correct me if I'm wrong. The dry skin is confusing me. Yes. Okay. So this is what I'm assuming. I'm assuming that you guys said trochlear because you have a closed eyelid. So you might think that maybe it's because the patient has their eyes down somewhat, that it kind of looks like they have a closed eyelid. Some of you are saying oculomotor because we have a constricted pupil. And some of you are saying it could be vagus or it could be trigeminal, potentially, I think, due to the dry skin, right? Now, the reason why I brought this for you guys is because this is actually not related to the cranial nerves at all. However, it is a brainstem sort of defect that can happen, and it can mimic a lot of issues that arise within other cranial nerves. This is what is known as Horner syndrome. So you'd have ptosis, meiosis, and anhidrosis, right? A closed eyelid, the pupillary constriction, and dry skin. When does this happen? This happens exactly partial ptosis, meiosis, and anhidrosis. When does this happen? This happens when we have a defect in the sympathetic tract. Now, the sympathetic tract is responsible for keeping the sweat glands secreting, keeping the eyelids open, and keeping the pupils dilated. This isn't the third cranial nerve because the pupils are constricted. The third works on constricting the pupil. So if I were to have an issue with the third, I would have pupillary dilation rather than pupillary constriction. The eyelid being closed is not related to any of the ones that you guys mentioned. It is related to the third, but in a different sense that we'll talk about later. But the dry skin, those glands are not by any way controlled with our cranial nerves. They are controlled by the sympathetic nerve system. So that is why we are actually seeing this three, like this combination. So the way, I'm sure if I said it with medical terminology, you guys would have gotten it. If I just said partial ptosis, meiosis, anhidrosis, I'm sure you guys would have gotten it right away. But this is Horner's syndrome that mimics a lot of lesions within the brainstem, but it is not a brainstem lesion. Okay, it is not a cranial nerve lesion. Actually, it can happen in the brainstem. Is that clear? All right. I hope this was helpful. I hope this like got your gears ticking a bit and like having to correlate between everything. If you want us to do more examples like this, we can a bit later. But for now, this is our checkpoint. So if you guys have any questions for me, please feel free to ask. If not, then we can take a short break, since we will be moving to the last portion, which is the actual nuclei, which in my opinion is the heaviest portion of this session. So let's take a break. We can come back at 5:40. If you guys want more time, I don't mind. We can come back at 5:45. That is also okay. Actually, let me just... Okay, so Maghrib is in 4 minutes. Yeah, so let's extend it so that we can all pray and then come back. Maghrib is at 3:49 at sorry 5:39. So mm, when do you guys think would be a good time for us to get back? If it's at 5:40, is 5:50 enough? Is 5:50 good? All right. Perfect. Okay. Then I shall meet you guys again at 5:50, inshallah. If you guys have any questions for me until then, please write them in the chat. And as soon as we are back, I will be answering them all, inshallah. Taqabbalullah from you guys in advance. We'll see you soon. All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, again. So right now we're about to start the actual bulk of the brainstem, and this will be the main portion that transitions into our next session for tomorrow, inshallah, at 7 p.m. So for tomorrow, it's going to be a lot more of the clinical aspects of things. It's going to be a lot more of the actual cross sections and lesions, and that is what is a lot more important for your final. However, I did not want to jump straight into that without giving you guys the basics. So everything that we've just spoken about, you can take as just a general overview of what we're about to be discussing very soon. Okay. Now, when I talk about cranial nerves, I told you guys that cranial nerves are specific. However, the cranial nerves are not specific. However, their cranial nuclei are specific. And what that means is that one single cranial nerve, just like we saw, can carry parasympathetic fibers, it can carry motor fibers, it can carry sensory fibers, right? However, that does not mean that all of those fibers are coming from one nucleus. And because of that, we have this confusion where some people are saying, how am I having so many different nuclei for the same cranial nerve, right? And what I want you guys to sort of imagine it as, credits to Raghda for this, is that it's kind of like a bus, right? Where it goes to different stations to pick up that specific thing and then it goes along its way. Or you can think of it as a pit stop where it goes to refuel and then it takes, like it goes to the mini market to get a couple of snacks and then it goes back on its way. So that is how the cranial nerves and the cranial nuclei are. Nuclei, once again, are specific in their functions. However, the cranial nerves have many, many different functions. Okay? What that looks like is this. When we talk about cranial nerve nuclei, we will talk about either efferent fibers, i.e. motor fibers, or afferent fibers, i.e. sensory fibers. So in efferent fibers, we're going to have three different types. Meanwhile, for afferent fibers, we're going to have four different types. For simplicity's sake, let's just consider that we have three types, okay? Those types are, first of all, going to be the ones that we had from the spinal cord. We have general somatic and general visceral, right? So we're going to have a general somatic efferent, general visceral efferent, then a general somatic afferent, and a general visceral afferent. So those are the exact same ones that we are carrying with us from the spinal cord upwards. Okay? However, as we move up to the brainstem, we begin to also see that we no longer only have those somatic muscles, we no longer only have those somatic portions with it, right? We also have things that are coming from the pharyngeal arches. Those are going to give rise to special somatic efferent and special somatic afferent for the sensory. So anything that is special somatic is for pharyngeal arches. Anything that is general is a continuation of the spinal cord, where we're going to have a general somatic efferent, general visceral efferent, and then a general visceral afferent, general somatic afferent. Okay? Now, what does any of this actually mean? And why did I say that we have four in sensory rather than three? The reason for that is that in sensory specifically, we also have a special visceral afferent. Okay? So we will not be able to see this, generally speaking, when we're talking about efferent. However, this SVA, or our special visceral afferent, is unique to the sensory fibers because it's going to give us our taste and smell. Okay? Now, for general somatic efferent, we have our motor supply to the muscles from the somites. For general visceral efferent, we have our parasympathetic supply to the smooth muscles and the glands. For general visceral afferent, once again, our parasympathetic supply, because this is the viscera, and this will go to the actual visceral organs. Our general somatic afferent is going to be sensory, so we have the head and neck region. Our special somatic efferent, when I'm talking about pharyngeal arches, will be the motor supply to those pharyngeal arches. Okay, and what those are, we will get to in a second. The special visceral afferent and the special somatic afferent are also from within those pharyngeal arches, but they're not supplying the muscles. Instead, they go along with those pharyngeal arches to give me our special sensations. Is that clear? Just a second. I think it stopped sharing. Just 1 second. Okay. I realized I need to edit something, so I'm gonna use this as a chance. All right. Okay. Should be able to see my screen again. Okay. Now, let us actually apply this to anatomy. We spoke about it functionally. We spoke about what each of these means. But how does this actually translate and how does this apply to what we're talking about? And why do we have this classification? Now, a bit about embryology is let's take a look at this structure here. Let's consider that this is the neural tube. This is the typical arrangement that you'd see within the spinal cord, where you have this central canal, and then you are going to have an alar plate and a basal plate. The alar plate is typically for our sensory sort of functions, while the basal plate is typically for our motor functions. Now, once we actually develop, it's no longer this rudimentary. We will begin to have two separate nuclei and two separate nuclei. One is going to be for general somatic afferents, one for general visceral afferents, and then one for general somatic efferents and general visceral efferents, okay? So you're going to have this arrangement right here. But as we move on and as we move upwards, the orientation sort of changes. So the way that I want you guys to imagine it is that this portion here is kind of opening itself up, okay? And it's pushing itself outwards to the sides here. So this would be our fourth ventricle. And then the arrangement of these nuclei would be the exact same in the sense that we have, once again, two motor nuclei here, and then two sensory nuclei on the sides, right? The difference is that as we go into the head and neck region, we have our pharyngeal arches. So we're no longer just going to be having our general somatic efferents and our general visceral efferents, and then our general visceral afferents and general somatic afferents. We will also begin to have our special visceral efferents and our special visceral afferents, and efferents. Okay? Does that make sense? So based on this, we can tell that the arrangement from medial to lateral would be for general somatic efferents here, then special visceral efferents for the pharyngeal arches, followed by general visceral efferents, then so general visceral afferents, special visceral afferents, and general somatic afferents. The way that I like to remember it is that anything that is supposed to be for the viscera is going to be sandwiched in the center. Okay? So anything that is somatic is going to be thrown on the sides, and anything that is visceral is going to be in the center. And always, always, the special is going to be in between any of the two other motor. So the middle portion, the medial portion, is going to be motor, and then the lateral portion is going to be sensory. Similarly, when we're looking at it like this, the anterior more portion is going to be motor, the posterior more portion is going to be sensory. And this applies throughout the entire brainstem. Is that clear? Perfect. Okay. So, given this arrangement, I now want us together to visualize what it would look like for the pons and for the midbrain. So, let's first draw out the general outline of the pons, where we have this fourth ventricle here. Yes, absolutely, I can repeat, yes. And then we have our peduncles, and it goes down like this. And then for the medulla, we're gonna have the colliculi here, and then the crus cerebri here with a central canal, right, for the aqueduct of Sylvius. So we mentioned that the arrangement within the spinal cord was such that we had the motor in the basal plate and the sensory in the alar plate. And this portion here was our visceral afferent, and this was our sensory afferent. Then this was our visceral efferent, and this was our special efferent. Okay? However, as we transition upwards into the brainstem, This is what I want you guys to imagine happening. This portion here is going to split open. And as that happens, we're going to have this alignment where both of the nuclei that we were seeing there are in this arrangement instead of being on top of each other. Since we now are in the brainstem, since we are in the head and neck region, we are not only supplying the somatic system, we're not only supplying somatic muscles, we also have branches coming from our pharyngeal arches. So think back to the embryology. These pharyngeal arches are basically those like kind of bumps where you have those indentations, you have those arches, and each of these arches is going to form a specific thing, which we'll be talking about in just a second. To accommodate those, we developed those nuclei right here in between. And they are for special visceral. Okay? So everything else that we had was for general visceral. So this is for somatic. We can no longer just say somatic afferent, visceral afferent, because we have a special viscera that is coming to us from the pharyngeal arches. So based on this arrangement, this would be our general somatic efferent. This would be our special visceral efferent. This would be our general visceral efferent. It seems a bit confusing to remember, but just remember that at the corners, so here and here, we're gonna have general somatic, okay? And then in the center, everything is gonna be visceral. And then in between every efferent and every afferent, we're gonna have a pharyngeal. So because of that, this is going to be our general visceral afferent, followed by our special visceral afferent. Does that make sense? Perfect, okay. Now let us try to translate that into what it would look like in the pons and in the midbrain. In the pons, it's a very, very, very similar arrangement where once again, we would have our motor nuclei here. On either side. We would also then have our special visceral from the pharyngeal arches. And then for our sensory, it would be more lateral and slightly upwards like this. Okay? So remember that this is your anterior. Okay? And we would also have the special visceral afferents. Now, within the midbrain, it has somewhat of a similar orientation to our spinal cord, right? It's compressing itself again, it looks a bit smaller. And because of that, the orientation is once again going to be a bit more similar to our spinal cord and kind of like a mix between both, where we have the motor components here more medially, and then the sensory components are more laterally and more towards the top here and here. You guys, I think, I get it by now, I hope. Is that clear? Because my screen is lagging. Okay, here and here. And then here and here. Okay, is that clear so far? Does that make sense? All right, perfect. So I want you guys to keep this arrangement in your head as we go through the brainstem nuclei and the brainstem sections, because this will really help with your orientation for everything. I said there was 4 for sensory. You're absolutely correct, which is the last remaining one is special somatic afferent, and that is for our hearing and our vision. And where that is, I will let you know in a second, okay? So it's completely its own thing as well. But good catch. All right. So now you know the arrangement. I want you guys to keep this in mind, okay? Be sure that medially is going to be motor, laterally is going to be sensory or afferent, anteriorly is going to be motor, posteriorly is going to be sensory or afferent. Now let's take a look at each of these functional categories and their respective nuclei. So this might seem a bit overwhelming the first time you do it, but this is how I personally studied and how I remembered this. So if you're able to understand this table, I feel like you're basically done with Brainstem. So let's take a look, first of all, at our general somatic efferents, okay? Now, I'm not sure why, for whatever reason, it wasn't letting me animate each line alone. So you're going to have to bear with me in showing the entire thing at once. But try to, first of all, think with me. General, somatic, and efferent. Okay, so this is a general sensation, which means it is not to the pharyngeal arches. This is somatic. Okay, so it's not to the viscera. And this is efferent, so it is motor. Can you guys think of what this might apply to within the head and neck region? Do we have any sort of muscles within the head and neck regions? Tongue, perfect. And what else? What else would be general somatic efferents? Eyes, perfect, absolutely. The eyes and the tongue, you're absolutely correct. The eyes and the tongue are ours. Actually, I'll put it at the end. The eyes and the tongue are the skeletal muscles that are going to be our general somatic efferents. Now, which cranial nerves are responsible for the muscles around the eye? 3, 4, and 6. Perfect. Which muscle, nerve is responsible for the muscles of the tongue? 12. Perfect. Now, given that we have cranial nerves 3, 4, 6, and 12, right? So where would 3 be based on the rule of fours that I told you guys about? Would it be in the midbrain? Would it be in the pons or in the medulla? Midbrain. Perfect. Above the pons, exactly. So in the midbrain, right? For 3 and 4 as well. What about 6? Would it be above the pons, in the pons, or in the medulla? Pons, perfect. All right, now lastly, we have cranial nerve number 12. Is this in the midbrain, pons, or medulla? Below in the medulla. Perfect. Absolutely amazing, mashallah. You are absolutely correct. We have 3 separate nuclei, right? Or 4 even separate nuclei. And I didn't write them in Roman numerals just because I realized some people struggle with them. So for simplicity's sake, I've done this. However, you guys do really need to know how to read Roman numerals. So just for like a bit off track, but just for a second, this is 1 in Roman numerals. This is 5. And obviously you could just write it like this as well. And this is 10. Okay? As I approach 5, numbers either get a 1 before or a 1 after. So there's 1 before 5, this means 4. And then there's 1 after 5, this means 6. There's 1 before 9, this means the 1 before 10, this means 9. 1 after 10, this means 11. So this is 1, this is 2, this is 3. And then we begin to have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Okay? Very briefly, very simply, just for the people that might struggle with them, to remember them this way, okay? So you use ones until you reach 4, and then you use fives until you reach 9. Anyways, slight interception, just in case. All right, back to our topic. We said that we have our general somatic efferents for the skeletal muscles that are in the eye and the tongue. So for the eye, we have cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6. And for the tongue, we have cranial nerve 12. So their nuclei for cranial nerve 3 should be in the midbrain, right? So let's place that in the midbrain right there. And then for cranial nerve 4, it should also be in the midbrain. So let's place that in the midbrain. Why not? And this is our general somatic efferents, right? Which is the most medial structure that we have. So we should have it very, very close to the midline. Next up, we have our sixth cranial nerve, our abducens nerve, which we said would be in the pons. So let's place that in the pons. Lastly, we have our hypoglossal nerve or our hypoglossal nucleus, which is in the medulla. And remember how I told you guys that the medulla is kind of stretched out, right? It stretches everything and it looks kind of like tubes. So every nucleus within this medulla is going to be very, very stretched out. Perfect. Now we know all the nerves, all the nuclei, sorry, that are located medially, right? Those are the most medial structures. Those are the efferent fibers that we have. And we know now why they're there. We know why this is their arrangement, because they supply the skeletal muscles of the eye and the tongue. And we know that those are the nerves that are responsible for this type of function. Perfect. Moving on now, what was our second thing? What was slightly lateral to our general somatic efferents? What is always sandwiched? GVE. Okay. So GVE would be correct if we were not in the brainstem, where we have our pharyngeal arches. So remember, there's always something that sandwiches itself in between. So think of a sandwich, S, somatic, special, special visceral, perfect. Special visceral efferents. You're absolutely correct. So special visceral efferents are for our pharyngeal arches. What do our pharyngeal arches give rise to? Well, our first pharyngeal arch, absolutely, for the muscles of mastication. Our second pharyngeal arch is for the muscles of facial expression. And then our third and fourth pharyngeal arches are for the muscles of the pharynx and the larynx. Given this information, do you guys think that you can guess which cranial nerves are contributing to this here? Okay, let's take it one by one. Muscles of mastication. What cranial nerve was the one that was responsible for the motor supply of the muscles of mastication? Trigeminal, 5. Absolutely. Okay. Secondly, we had the facial expression. So the muscles of facial expression, facial nerve, perfect, 7. All right, the third and fourth were for the pharynx and the larynx. Which cranial nerves were responsible for those? 9 and 10, absolutely. You guys are absolutely correct. Okay, given what we just said, is cranial nerve 5 in the pons, in the medulla, in the midbrain? Where is it? Pons. Perfect. Okay. Is cranial nerve 7 in the pons, the medulla, or the midbrain? Pons, exactly. Okay, what about 9 and 10? Are they in the midbrain, the pons, or the medulla? Medulla. Absolutely wonderful. So let's take a look at that now. Our special visceral efferents are from our pharyngeal arches. The first is for mastication. The second is for facial expression. The third and fourth are for the pharynx and larynx. This brings us to this arrangement. So the first is for the fifth cranial nerve, right? What is it going to give? It is going to give one tiny, tiny nucleus in the pons for its motor supply. Because we said that the trigeminal is primarily a sensory type of nerve, right? Now, facial expression is carried by the seventh cranial nerve, which is the facial. And the facial will have its own nucleus also in the pons, however, in the lower pons. So almost at the pons medullary junction. Okay? Lastly, both cranial nerves 9 and 10 are going to join together from what is known as the nucleus ambiguus. This nucleus ambiguus is called ambiguous because it doesn't really have a specific shape. They're not really sure what comes from it. They're like, it's kind of ambiguous. We're not really sure what's going on. And remember how I told you, 9 always likes to try. So it thought of this as an adventure. It was like, oh, okay, well, this is like it's super mysterious. I want to see what's happening. And since we are in the second most medial point, then it will be right there in the medulla, also stretched out. Is this clear for everyone? Perfect. Okay, moving on to the last efferent fiber type. Could I repeat that? Absolutely. The entire SVE or a specific point? I don't mind either way, I just want to clarify. Nucleus ambiguous. Okay. So nucleus ambiguous is a nucleus that is responsible, basically, for providing the motor supply to the third and fourth pharyngeal arch. And that is what goes to the pharynx and larynx. It does not care what nerve carries it. It does not care who comes to it. And it was called the nucleus ambiguous because it did not have a very specific shape. No one really knew what it was or what it was talking about. And so because of that, it was given this ambiguous name. Now, looking at the nerves that actually contribute to this, the ones that are going to be supplying the pharynx and larynx, we have cranial nerves number 9 and 10. So it is the glossopharyngeal, sorry, that is gonna go. It's super curious about things. It wants to discover things, so it's gonna go to this ambiguous nucleus, and then the vagus nerve is gonna come after it and pick up where it left off and supply the rest of the muscles of the pharynx and the larynx. So it's one nucleus, but both of these nerves are going to actually emerge from it to go and supply the muscles of the pharynx and the larynx. Is that clear? Perfect. Okay. Now, what was the last thing that we had in efferents? So we've done general somatic, we've done special visceral. What else do we have? General visceral efferents. Perfect. So we said that general visceral efferent is for what? It's for parasympathetic, right? And it's specifically to smooth muscles and to glands. So can you guys think of where those might be or what those are? Pupillary constriction, vagus nerve, okay. And what else? Salivation, absolutely wonderful, mashallah. You guys have covered all of them. So we have three things within this general visceral efferents. We're going to have pupillary constriction. We're going to have our lacrimation, our salivation, and finally, we're going to have the actual supply to the viscera. So the GIT, the CVP, respiration, so on and so forth. Okay. Which nerve did we say was responsible for pupillary constriction? 3. Amazing. Which nerve did we say was responsible for lacrimation? 7. Which nerve did we say was responsible for salivation? There were 2. Absolutely. Really glad you got that. 7 and 9. Absolutely. Okay. And then finally, All the rest of the parasympathetic, GIT, CVP, respiration, all of that is for our vagabond, right? It's for the vagus nerve. Okay, perfect. So we know that pupillary constriction is done by cranial nerve number 3. We know that lacrimation is done by cranial nerve number 7. We know that salivation is done by cranial nerve 7 and 9. And finally, we know that the vagus nerve will give me the parasympathetic supply to everything else. Where is cranial nerve number 3, midbrain, pons, or medulla? Midbrain. Where is cranial nerve number 7? Pons. Number 9? And number 10? Perfect. Okay. You're absolutely correct. So let's take a look at that now. The pupillary constriction is done by cranial nerve number 3. The lacrimation is done by cranial nerve number 7. Salivation through the submandibular and sublingual is done by cranial nerve number 7. And parotid is done by cranial nerve number 9. For all of the rest, for GIT, CVP, respiration, etc., it is done by the vagus nerve. Okay, now this is where things get a bit interesting. Here, since this is parasympathetic, I am not just talking about the regular nucleus of that nerve. Instead, I am talking about a specific nucleus that will be able to give me or recruit those parasympathetic supplies. For cranial nerve number 3, it is the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Okay? And do you guys remember which ganglion it went to eventually to then cause the pupillary constriction? Where did we have that synapse? No. I honestly really appreciate the honesty. Okay, otic is a good guess because it kind of sounds like optic, right? But remember I said parotic, otic, parotid, right? So the Edinger-Westphal nucleus is where the third cranial nerve is going to recruit pterygopalatine. Also close. Also, you guys are like, I appreciate that you're trying to guess with actual names of nuclei, even if they're incorrect. Like, I really appreciate that. But what those are, we'll get to in a second. So the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which you guys can find right here, it basically sits on top of the nucleus for the third cranial nerve, and it gives it its parasympathetic supply. This is going to go and travel to the ciliary ganglion. Yes, there we go. It's going to go to the ciliary ganglion, which will then give branches to the ciliary muscle to cause pupillary constriction. Okay? Is that clear? Perfect. Lacrimation is caused by the 7th cranial nerve. Okay? The 7th cranial nerve is going to go and give me a supply to which ganglion that causes lacrimation? You guys just mentioned it. It's next to the eye. Pterygopalatine and submandibular, absolutely. So for lacrimation, we're going to have the superior salivatory nucleus basically emerge, okay, and then it gives the parasympathetic supply to cranial nerve number 7. And then after that, cranial nerve number 7 will either go to the pterygopalatine ganglion or the submandibular ganglion. So all of the parasympathetic fibers are all coming from the superior salivatory nucleus. Then they will split to go to either the pterygopalatine ganglion or the submandibular ganglion. In the pterygopalatine ganglion, they will stimulate lacrimation. In the submandibular ganglion, they will stimulate salivation of the submandibular and the sublingual. Next up, we have our parotid. So this is where our superior salivatory would be, okay? Next up, we have our parotid gland. for salivation, which we said was supplied by the ninth cranial nerve. And the nucleus that is responsible for this is the inferior salivatory. Now, the reason why I wrote pons is that it's once again at this junction. So it's slightly moving upwards towards this superior salivatory nucleus, but it's not really up there yet, and it's more at the junction between the two, okay? Now, this inferior salivatory nucleus is going to give us the parasympathetic supply through the glossopharyngeal nerve. It's going to go to the otic ganglion, and then this otic ganglion will innervate the parotid gland. Is that clear? Are those three nuclei clear for you guys? Because I know they can get very confusing. Can I please repeat for superior? Okay. Let me actually just, 1 second, show you the image that we had earlier on. If I could get that. The one here, this one. Okay. All right. So let's look at this here. So we have our cranial nerves that are responsible for parasympathetic. These are our general, visceral, efferents, right? Our third cranial nerve, we see arising here, right? We see arising here and giving a supply. It arises from a nucleus known as the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. After it arises from this Edinger-Westphal nucleus, it's going to go to the ciliary ganglion, and then the ciliary ganglion will supply the ciliary muscle of the eye to cause pupillary constriction. Next up, we have our facial nerve. Our facial nerve is going to come from the superior salivatory nucleus, okay? Which you guys can see here as well. The superior salivatory nucleus is going to supply the parasympathetic supply to the facial nerve, and it is then going to split for two different ganglia. The first one is the pterygopalatine ganglion. The second is the submandibular ganglion. The pterygopalatine ganglion is going to go and supply the lacrimal gland, which will stimulate tear production. The submandibular ganglion is going to go supply the submandibular and the sublingual glands for salivation. Moving on, we have our glossopharyngeum, where we have the inferior salivatory nucleus. This inferior salivatory nucleus is going to give its parasympathetic supply to our glossopharyngeal nerve, As it does that, it goes to the otic ganglion, which then supplies the parotid gland for salivation. Lastly, we're going to be having our vagus nerve with its own entire nucleus that is then going to go to the viscera, and it will communicate with various different ganglia depending on which organ it is actually going to. Is that clear? Does that make sense now? Yes. Of course, I've got you guys. Okay. So let us go back to this. Okay. So we had, just a second, let me put the chat up again. All right, there we go. Okay, so we said that we have 4 separate nuclei for our general visceral efferents. Starting off, we have pupillary constriction by cranial nerve number 3. The nucleus for it is our Edinger-Westphal nucleus in the midbrain. Next up, we have our lacrimation carried by the superior salivatory of cranial nerve number 7. in the pons. This will then go to the pterygopalatine or the submandibular. And then for salivation, we have, once again, the submandibular and sublingual by the facial nerve through the superior salivatory. And then we have the parotid through the inferior salivatory, which is for the ninth cranial nerve. Now this, once again, is in the medulla, but it's at the junction, which is why I moved it up a bit, okay? Lastly, we have our vagabond, the vagus nerve, which is going to carry our GIT, CVP, respiration, all of that. And it is in the medulla, so it is once again very, very stretched out. Those are all of our efferent nuclei. This arrangement from medial to lateral is very, very helpful, even when you're looking at cross sections. And I want you guys to keep this ingrained in your memory. I want you guys to keep this table saved in your head. This is what saved me in the exam. I kid you not, honestly. Like, if not for this table that I wrote down, nothing would have made sense. So, before I move on to the afferents, do you guys understand efferent well? Do you know everything about efferent now? Would you like me to repeat anything? All clear, all good. Perfect. Okay. So let's move on to afferents. Now, just for simplicity's sake, I will just be using this half. However, you should know that all of these are also present here, and everything I am drawing is more lateral to those, okay? So even if I'm gonna draw it here for simplicity, it does not mean that it is at the midline. It is after all of these. So it is here, basically. Okay, is that clear? All right. So we said, once again, we're starting off with our visceral, right? Because that's the one that is in the middle. And before we move on to the somatic, something wants to sandwich itself in between, which is our special, right? And that is for the pharyngeal arches. Now, in the case of afferents, the general visceral afferents and the special visceral afferents are actually both going to share the same nucleus. So let's actually figure out first, what could potentially be our general visceral afferents? What is going to be a sensation from parasympathetic? Can you guys think of something? The tongue, taste. Okay, would we consider this to be parasympathetic taste? No. All right. So when I'm talking about general visceral, remember, I am talking about parasympathetic. But for special visceral, you guys are absolutely correct. It would be taste because this is from the viscera and it is a special sensation. So this would be taste. But for general visceral afferents, what about hearing? Are you the same person that asked about the fourth thing? No? Okay. Because that would have been iconic because that is the fourth thing. So we'll get to that in a second. Okay. So for general visceral afferents, I'm talking about parasympathetic supply. Very simply, it is just the organs, right? It is the vagus nerve. When we have ischemia somewhere, when we have something going on, you know how it hikes against the sympathetic and it goes and tells there's something wrong. So GI and the heart, exactly. So those would all be the general visceral afferents for us. The special visceral afferents, as you guys very correctly said, is taste. Taste is a special sensation, and it is in the viscera, like it is in the tongue. Okay? Which nerve would be responsible for getting this general visceral afferent from the GIT, CVP, respiration, etc.? 10th, exactly. And for taste, what did we say it was? Trigeminal for anterior two-thirds. Trigeminal is for anterior two-thirds, that is correct, but it wasn't for taste of anterior two-thirds. It was just for sensation. What was for the taste? Facial, absolutely, yes, you guys are correct. So taste from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue is through facial, And then from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, it is through, exactly, through glossopharyngeal. Okay? So we have our GIT, CVP, respiration through the 10th cranial nerve, and then our taste is through the 7th and the 9th. Both of those are going to arise from a nucleus called nucleus tractus solitarius. It is this huge nucleus here that you see extending. Okay, guys, once again, this is more lateral here, okay, which is for simplicity's sake. This is a huge nucleus that you can see is mainly in the medulla, but it extends even to the pontomedullary junction. This nucleus carries 7, 9, and 10, which is a very odd combination, but not when you consider it based on the type, right? So don't try to limit yourself to just thinking about a nerve, a cranial nerve, and one of its nuclei, because that's not the case, right? We already said that vagus already has something here. What is it doing here again? We already said that our 9th cranial nerve was in nucleus ambiguous. What is it doing here again? As I said, cranial nerves are not specific, but their nuclei are. So one cranial nerve might receive fibers from various different nuclei. So don't limit yourself. Try to think of it based on the actual function and correlate it to what the cranial nerve does. Is this clear? Perfect. Okay, now we said that for afferents, we also have something that is special, which is our hearing. Yes, that is the special somatic afferent. And that is hearing. Hearing is done through the 8th cranial nerve. However, when I am referring to the special somatic afferent, I am actually referring to the inferior colliculus. So right here. Okay, and when I'm referring to the inferior colliculus, I'm talking about an auditory reflex. I'm talking about something that has to do with actually being able to hear. So don't limit yourself to thinking that just because cranial nerve number 8 is found in the pons, I would not be able to find anything relating to it in the midbrain. This is that exception, where the special somatic afferent that is very unique is actually found in the midbrain. It is actually found in the inferior colliculus, and it gives me this hearing. Does that make sense? Perfect. Okay. Lastly, we have our general somatic afferents. So somatic means I'm talking about somatic muscles, and general means it's not something that is from the pharyngeal arches, and this is afferent, so it is sensory. What is sensory from somatic muscles? The tongue. The tongue is a skeletal muscle, and in that sense, it would not be sensory, right? The tongue and the eyes would both be motor. It would be efferent fibers. I'm talking about something that is purely sensory here. So mastication, proprioception. So mastication is once again what? It is the first pharyngeal arch, right? But proprioception, you guys are correct. Olfactory. Olfactory and optic both do not have anything to do with the brainstem. So we do not even consider them. Pain. Yes, there we go. Think very to discrimination, pain, and temperature. Absolutely. We're talking about the general sensations here, you guys. I understand because everything else is complicated. This also seems complicated, but this one's actually super simple. It is the actual general sensations that we have. So it's sensations to the face and the neck. And which cranial nerve carries this? Trigeminal. There we go. Now the tri Okay. Now, the trigeminal nucleus is unique in the sense that it is absolutely huge and it covers the length of the entire brainstem. Okay? Now, the reason for that is it is not actually just one nucleus, instead, it is three nuclei that are all connected. So you can start to think, okay, we have trigeminal for three roots, V1, V2, and V3, and for three nuclei. Does that make sense? Is it because of the three branches? You would think so, which is very valid. However, once again, the nuclei are specific, the nerves are not. So I cannot say that the ophthalmic branch is going to come just from this portion of the nucleus and it will only carry what this nucleus carries, because we also require things that are in the other nuclei. Does that make sense? Okay. So actually looking at it, we have three separate nuclei for the facial nerve, for the trigeminal nerve, which is the mesencephalic. So this is going to be more towards the mesencephalon, right? It is in the midbrain. This is the mesencephalon, the mesencephalic. We have the principal sensory. So think pons, P, principal. So this is the principal one. And then spinal, because the medulla is the one that extends down to the spine. So this is the spinal portion. The mesencephalic portion is responsible for proprioception. The principal portion is responsible for touch, and the spinal portion is responsible for pain and temperature. So you can kind of correlate it to the tracks that you've taken, and you can think that, okay, so even here, we're actually going to be separating between what we're doing and what we're looking at. So those are the three trigeminal nuclei, our mesencephalic for proprioception, our principal sensory for touch, and our spinal for pain and temperature. Is this clear for everyone? Perfect. With that, this session has actually come to an end because I don't want to overwhelm you guys even more with cross sections and all of that. So we will be covering those tomorrow, inshallah. Would you like me to go over very briefly again just those two tables very, very quickly, or are we good? Can you ask you questions, you mean? Can I send the slides? I will be sending them tomorrow, inshallah, with everything compiled all together, just because it would be easier for you guys to follow along that way. Can I ask questions? Okay. How will I ask questions without going into lesions just yet? Can you explain the arrangement of... Okay, sure. Yes, absolutely. Let me just go back here. Okay. Okay. So we have... Let me pull up. So looking at the spinal cord and looking at the arrangement that we typically have during embryonic development, you can see that we start off with an basal plate and an alar plate, right? This basal plate is what carries the motor and efferent fibers, while this alar plate is what carries the sensory or afferent fibers. With progression, you then begin to have those two separate nuclei and those two separate nuclei. One is for somatic efferent, one is for visceral efferent. Then you have one that is for visceral afferent and one for somatic afferent. Now what happens is, this is the level of the spinal cord. As we move up, I'm going to try to draw it out. You can see that this begins to slightly open up like this. Why is this so deformed? But anyway, you get the point. this portion here is going to open up, and you're going to start to have this basically. And then it will transition into this. Okay? Once you have this transition, you are already in the medulla. You are already in the brainstem. So you're already in the head and neck region. And because of that, you will no longer only have your general somatic efferents and your general visceral efferents and your general visceral afferents and your general somatic afferents. You will also begin to have those structures here, which are from the pharyngeal arches. These give rise to a special visceral efferent and a special visceral afferent. Okay? And because of this splitting and this arrangement, you will have the medial-most structures being motor and the lateral-most structures being sensory. And this is how we look at it in the pons. This is how we look at it in the midbrain, where once again, medial is motor, and it's also a bit more anterior. And then lateral is for sensory, and it is more posterior. Now, the actual arrangement, the way that you can remember it is, we will have somatic on either ends of the extreme with visceral sandwiched in between. And then you have the sandwich again for these special. So special here and special here. And then the general visceral and the closest between each other. So looking at the arrangement on the actual slide again, you can see that you have your general somatic efferents most medially, followed by the special visceral efferents, followed by the general visceral efferents with your parasympathetics. Then you will have your afferent fibers. So you will have from medially to laterally, you will have the general visceral afferents, followed by, since this has, again, see the colors, it also has special visceral afferents, followed by special somatic afferent, followed by general somatic afferent, which is in your trigeminal. Does that make sense? Perfect. Okay, you want me to ask you some questions? I'll have this open here. If you guys can please scan the QR code, and I will ask you some questions. Can I go over the rule of fours again? I actually have not covered the rule of fours yet. The only thing that I have covered is the fact that you have 4 cranial nerves above the pons, 4 cranial nerves within the pons, and 4 cranial nerves below the pons. So 1 and 2 are going to go straight from the brain to their target. 3 and 4 are going to be in the midbrain. Then 5, 6, 7, and 8 are going to be in the pons. 9, 10, 11, and 12 are all going to be in the medulla. No, I did not go over the rule of fours. I kept that for tomorrow, inshallah. And you guys, if you could please scan this QR code for your feedback, I would really appreciate it. For those of you that would like to stay for a couple of questions, then we can do that. Let me see, what can I ask you? Because I don't wanna ask about the lesions and stuff yet. Let's see. Okay, so let's say that someone presents to you and you realize that they have a brainstem injury. Okay, so you do an MRI, you do a CT with contrast, and do all of that without contrast, sorry, and you check that they have an injury to the superior colliculus. Okay. First of all, what does the superior colliculus carry? Vision, eyes, okay. And what is at the level of the superior colliculus as well? We have 2 nuclei, right? 3 and something that gives 3. So 4 is actually at the level of the inferior colliculus. Instead of 4, we have the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, right? Which is the parasympathetic of cranial nerve number 3. So since both of those are affected, the vision of the person would be affected. Yes, exactly. They would not be able to move their eye except laterally, so they would only be able to abduct it because of the abducens nerve. They would only be able to turn it inwards and downwards because of the trochlear nerve. They would also have very, very, very dilated pupils, right? Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. Now, what else? Let's talk about if someone were to have, hmm, would it be more helpful if I was writing things down and you guys would like follow along, or is this fine? Because I want to keep the QR code here. I think I could just write in this tiny white space. This is fine? Okay, perfect. Okay. So let's say that someone presents with okay, if someone were to have an issue with the with their taste, okay, so they lost their taste. What else would you expect them to lose? Nucleus tractus solitarius. Okay. Lacrimation. Is lacrimation from the same nucleus? We're talking about the level of nuclei here. You would be absolutely correct in the fact that since this can potentially be an injury to the facial nerve, you might also have an issue with lacrimation. But yes, GI, CVP, vagus, absolutely. So when we have this injury to taste, remember from here, you will also be injuring the vagus nerve, right? This is nucleus tractus solitarius, yes. Okay, is that clear? If someone had an issue with no longer being able to swallow, which nucleus is affected and where is that in the brainstem? At which level? Nucleus ambiguous, perfect. Where is that? Is that in the brain, the brainstem? Is that in the midbrain? Is it in the pons or medulla? Perfect. Yes, it is in the medulla. Perfect. Okay. If a person was no longer able to feel the sensation on their cheek, what nerve would be affected? Facial. Okay. And what else would you expect to be deficient? Lacrimation. See, that would have been great if you guys got the first one right, because it's trigeminal. Because I'm talking about sensation here, right? I said they were not able to feel on their cheek. I did not tell you they were not able to smile, for example. So the muscles of facial expressions are the ones that are supplied by the facial nerve. But the sensation to the face is all by trigeminal. So what they would lose alongside that is not being able to chew, right? Because it supplies the muscles of mastication as well. Perfect. And are those both from the same nucleus? Are they different nuclei? The same. The very long one. Okay, the very long one has 3 parts, absolutely. But all of that is sensory. There's a very tiny, tiny motor nucleus that is carried by V3, that actually goes to supply the muscles of mastication. It is not solitarious. It is just its own thing. No, it's not solitarious. Solitarious, as we see here, is for taste. It's not for mastication. Mastication, let's look at that again, is here. It's this one, V3 root. Okay? Clear? Perfect. All right. I think we should wrap up now. I have taken up more than enough of your time. Inshallah, for tomorrow, as I mentioned, we will be going over the cross sections as well as the actual lesions, which should be very fun, inshallah. I hope this was beneficial for you guys. I tried my best to make it as digestible as possible and as simple as possible. Sure, take a picture of this one. There you go. When is tomorrow's session? It is at 7 p.m., inshallah, which is very interesting because of how long it might be. I know that Brainstem can be very frightening and can be very annoying to go through, but I really, really, really hope that through this you guys have been able to understand it in a slightly more systemic manner. Um, and for tomorrow, inshallah, as I said, we will be going over the cross sections as well as the actual lesions. So for the cross sections, I want you guys to be very, very, very familiar with these two, because when I give you a cross section of the medulla, I want you to be able to visualize this. Okay, I want you to be able to see this how it is now. Sure, here. Sure thing. Okay, and before you guys leave, once again, if you can please just scan this QR code to give your feedback. If you have any questions for me, I will be more than happy to take them before tomorrow, because my final is on next Sunday, which is not tomorrow, as in like the Sunday after that. So I will not be available until then. However, before your midterm, inshallah, if you guys have any questions for me, I will be more than happy to help. Until then, take care of yourselves, everyone. Best of luck with everything. Please get some rest. Thank you.